At the moment when the monster appears from behind the tree, the guy is mentally reasoning. Looking more closely at the face of this monster, he thinks that this world is crazy. His name is Civilian, and he continues to reason. But the monster does not sleep, tearing away from the spot. However, the guy remains calm, thinking that you can have absolute power over this crazy world. But at the same time, he does not deny the fact that a person can also be under someone's power. The guy pulls away at the very last moment, when the monster is literally millimeters away from him. Naturally, the monster is not happy with this arrangement and begins to snort angrily. And at this moment, Civilian thinks that the world is fading more and more, and he is lost without power. But as he throws a net over the monster, the young man wonders if this is too radical. Well, the creature, due to its clumsiness, can only continue to watch as it finds itself in an ever-deepening trap. The boy asks his prey if, in this world, the value of sweets is not greater than the value of meat. And the creature responds with a protesting roar, unable to do anything else. Civilian continues to have a silent monologue with himself, thinking that this is not fantasy. Meanwhile, the monster continues to make pathetic attempts to escape from its trap. And the guy is already speaking out loud, considering what is happening impossible, because a lot of time has passed since he did it. By his words, he means this network, which consists of a super hard molecular wire. And these mounts are called built-in pocket drones. Civilian, amazed by the result, is going to take further action. When a weapon appears in his hand, the guy begins to talk about the monster that is in front of him. He says they are powerful, big, and have no intelligence. He is not sure it is normal to be affected by such things. He aims his pistol at the monster and hesitates for just a moment, after which the sound of a shot is heard in the forest thicket. Some time ago, the catastrophe predicted by Northern Ramatus descended on Earth. Its essence consisted of bringing this meteorite directly to our planet. As soon as this became known, many countries began to look for ways to solve the problem. However, despite the multitude and diversity of resources, none of them, alas, managed to do this. At the moment when the collision was about to occur, everyone waited with bated breath. The believers prayed fervently to their God that he, if not at least spared them from such an end, would make it less painful. Many chose to spend their last moments with their families, wanting to give them all their remaining time. However, instead of what they expected, something defied logic. Everything that had been a harbinger of imminent, inevitable disaster began to disappear. With each passing second, the sky became brighter, and the haze began to clear. And so it went on until everything became perfectly clear and the meteorite disappeared. People could not believe what was happening, wondering if they had only seen an illusion. But this was not so, because from that very moment, troubles began. Monsters began to appear literally out of nowhere. They were very different, reminiscent of some animals and at the same time unlike others. And although it was not a war, people desperately tried to fight back against these monsters. They were in for a disappointment because all conventional weapons were practically useless. And because of this confrontation, the world gradually became more and more devastated. 20 years have passed since then, and during this time, a lot has changed. Monsters have become resources. People appeared who called themselves hunters, and gradually the number of people with such abilities increased. Hunters lived to fight monsters for the future of humanity, or simply for money. Wealth and poverty no longer mattered, as the hunters now stood at the very top of the hierarchy. The creature is still alive and continues to try to throw off the net. Bursting into a thunderous roar, the monster seems to be trying to delay the inevitable. But it's all in vain. Civilian loads his pistol again, saying goodbye to the creature. And this becomes the last thing the monster hears before dying this time. The guy hesitates for a moment and then begins to talk about the ability to use SF-like objects. He recalls words that are a request to someone to give a little time and resources. At this moment, the weapon in Civilian's hand completely disappears, transforming into another object. It turns out to be this glove, which continues to crackle with static for some time. At the moment when everything ends, the guy continues to reason to himself. He thinks that this is the ability to create science fiction things that he could not have even imagined before. The boy recalls that when his superpowers first appeared, he was a 7-year-old child. Then the superhumans became heroes, and Civilian was very envious of them. Watching all these people, the boy found them incredibly cool. He believed that they came the best and would leave the best, since monsters cost a lot of money. Such people made hundreds of millions every month, since energy resources are very valuable. Civilian begins to talk about himself, remembering that he graduated from a good college. However, even despite this, he is dissatisfied with his life. After all, even after his graduation in the army, the young man, at 27, works part-time. Civilian reflects that over the past 20 years, the only thing that has changed in his country is the cost of snacks. And yet, putting out his cigarette, the young man takes his words back. He agrees that, if you really think about it, some things have changed. The northern part of his country was destroyed because it could not put up a decent resistance to the monsters. She couldn't hold them back, even though bullets worked on these monsters. The main problem in this confrontation was the number of creatures, because there were too many of them. The military was unable to cope because it was simply impossible to repel the onslaught of such a countless number of enemies. But not only part of this country was destroyed, some others were also captured by monsters. What can I say? Half of the entire planet was captured by these creatures. This took place in a wide variety of climate zones and locations of varying sizes. Yet the remaining people hold on. And this is the main reason why hunters are in demand. This also affected the crossing of hunters from the country of our hero of the 38th parallel. Stretching, Civilian asks rhetorically how all this concerns him specifically. He thinks that all this time he was the most ordinary citizen and that he will always be so. Remembering that superhumans usually revealed themselves before they were 20, the guy believes that in his case this was no longer possible. At the moment the bell on the door rings, the cashier greets his customer. The first thing that catches Civilian's attention is the rhythmic clicking of heels. Following the sound, everything else catches the eye, causing involuntary thoughts in the young man's head. He involuntarily thinks that he and this girl are on completely different levels. Meanwhile, the visitor places the star necklace on the counter. Our hero knows what it is. This item is made from the crystal of a monster that was captured. While punching the necklace, the guy also remembers that jewelry is needed to complete the mission. This mission will only unlock and develop the ability if you have the star necklace when you complete it. After paying the customer, Civilian watches her until she leaves the store. He thinks that he has one of these too, but he has never worn it because it is embarrassing, keeping it only in his pocket. After this, since there are no clients other than the beauty, the guy starts to occupy himself with something. Things are being done, but time still drags on painfully slowly. Civilian can't stop thinking about it, periodically catching himself having thoughts of this kind. However, at some point he forgets himself and comes to his senses only by glancing at his watch. After the working day is over, the guy goes straight home. Entering and turning on the light, Civilian describes his house as small but cozy. Stretching, the guy notes the fact that another working day has passed. Glancing towards the bathroom, a question arises in Civilian's mind. The guy asks himself whether he should take a shower now, and then answers himself. He refuses, citing that he is lazy, and decides to take a shower when there is an opportunity. Instead, the guy makes a different decision. He says that he'd rather eat. However, Civilian is collecting what is left, and his choice is limited. After the guy slowly sorts out his food, he faces a new dilemma. Looking at this mountain of unwashed dishes, he wonders whether he should go to bed. This is what Civilian does. But there is no sleep in either eye, and his thoughts won't let go. The guy thinks that he's even gotten used to all of this, since he's been living like this for a whole year. He knows for sure that, although his work is hard, he cannot achieve anything with it. Civilian is confident that if this continues, he will eventually be eaten away by all the debts accumulated over the years. He makes a comparison to walking along a dark road without lights and looking for a way out. Thinking that he is drowning in the swamp, the guy suddenly hears a strange voice that says that he must. He thinks he's having a hallucination, but the voice keeps coming, asking if he should give him power. Civilian sits up abruptly and wonders what this nonsense is. Many questions begin to swarm in his head, but the essence of each of them is to understand what is happening. The voice appears again, saying that he does not need an answer and that he will give him strength. And the moment he spoke again, saying just one word that encouraged him to live, pain pierced the boy's eyes. Civilian felt that at that moment something changed in him, as if the world began to feel different. But at the same time there was pain, very strong and disproportionate, forcing me to scream. And from this pain the guy lost consciousness, unable to cope with it. This was his awakening. In the darkness in which Civilian found himself, at first there was nothing. But then a light flashed. Although the guy didn't know its source, something incredibly drew him to it, and he decided not to resist this call. Moreover, finding himself very close, he extended his hand towards the source of light, wanting to touch it because it attracted him. The pull was so strong that it clouded all common sense. He needed to touch it. But the guy woke up with completely different emotions, his eyes wide open in fear. The measured ticking of the clock gradually helps him return to reality. And yet, this is not easy for the guy because he still feels different. When Civilian sits up, he feels as if his head hurts even more. Groaning in pain, he says that his head is simply splitting. The sound of the clock catches the guy's attention, and, glancing at it, he almost screams. He is surprised that he has been unconscious for several hours already. Civilian begins to speak, trying to recall the last memories in his memory. However, both this and even the headache fade into the background when he notices the glow. In an uncertain voice, he begins to slowly ask a question, rhetorically asking what it is. The guy assumes that he is dreaming all of this because he believes that all of this cannot be real. But still, an unknown force forces Civilian to pronounce the words that call up the status window. And the next moment, the guy is silent, unable to find the words to describe his amazement. But the guy pulls himself together and begins to study the information that appears on his status window. When he received his abilities, he already knew perfectly well what they were and how to use them. The Civilian's ability to create fantastic items using crystals. The guy talks about how, at his current level, he can create things weighing less than 1 kilogram. But at the same time, he is confused by the name of the ability, because it is called "If I Had More Time and Money." Since the guy doesn't know how his ability works in reality, he's going to find out. Civilian says that just time and money would be useful. The guy wonders if he should start experimenting right now. Taking the star necklace out of his pocket, he comes to the conclusion that he won't understand until he tries it. Several options come to mind, but they all turn out to be much heavier than 1 kilogram. Then the boy remembers the weapon he saw in a spy movie when he was a kid. Thoughts come to mind that this thing could even melt a wall. Looking at the necklace, Civilian notes that it is small and does not look particularly complex, but he is still tormented by doubts. The guy is wondering if it will work properly, and yet, despite this, he speaks the words that activate Civilian's ability. At that very moment, the star necklace flashes with a bright light, foreshadowing the process of its transformation. The currents that form around the object pick it up, starting to form a luminous vortex. Literally a few moments later, the first results of the transformation become visible. Well, when everything is finished, the item that he wanted to receive appears above Civilian's hand. When it lands in his hand, the boy looks at it silently for a while, and the next moment he comes to the conclusion that the weapon turned out to be even smaller than he imagined. But the next moment, the guy throws these thoughts out of his head. He can't wait to try out his formidable weapon. Wondering what he could try it on, an idea came to Civilian's mind. He says that a kettle will do, arguing that he rarely uses it anyway. Before pressing the button, the guy waits, counting down the moments. And the next thing you know, a strange sound starts coming from the weapon, as if it were loading. What happens next makes Civilian literally cry out in surprise. The spectacle that appears before his eyes exceeds all his expectations, so the guy is just silent for a while, trying to digest everything. This is quite difficult for him, but interesting thoughts begin to appear in his head. Initially, Civilian wonders if he really has received such a crazy ability, and the thoughts that arise in his head are connected with high salaries, a conglomeration of monsters and other things in this vein. Beginning to accept this fact, the guy jumps out of bed, saying that his life has found meaning again. Ability users are people who can become hunters. They are the richest among the rich. Civilian thinks that even if he becomes a hunter, there is a problem, and that is the hunter's license. This certificate can only be obtained by proving that you have mastered the ability. The absolute advantage here is that you will be financed. However, along with this, one very delicate problem arises. It is relevant for each of the hunters and lies in their survival. After all, the job of hunters is to destroy dangerous monsters, so one wrong step for them could end in death. It is also possible to become a hunter without any abilities, although your rank will depend on this. But if you are too confident in your weapon, then there is a high probability that you are doomed to death. Civilian repeats himself again, talking about unlocking his abilities and becoming an official hunter, and he sees a problem in this, because then your ability will be known to everyone. There have been cases where hunters have attacked each other, but once their abilities are revealed, this is simply useless. Therefore, if you don't have a desire to die, it's worth keeping your abilities a secret. The body of a person who uses abilities is no different from a normal one. If you don't want to disclose your ability, becoming a hunter is the best option. This is why our hero came to the training, although admission here is not free. For people like him, there is an opportunity to pay for training with money he has and money he doesn't have. While the instructor introduces herself, Civilian thinks about how bored he is, even though his safety directly depends on it. Suddenly, his gaze is drawn to a man standing nearby. He seems familiar to Civilian, so the guy assumes that he is some kind of celebrity. Taking a closer look at him, he finds the man handsome and admits to himself that he is envious. Meanwhile, Instructor Isabella announces the start, saying that the first 100 will have a chance to rest. And when the first training session begins, the woman carefully watches its process, remaining in her place. Civilian, recalling what happened this month, admits that he had to sweat because he had to experience pain in literally every one of his muscles. They were trained without mercy, forcing them to carry out tasks even in the harshest weather conditions. And all this had to be done with gritted teeth, because it was the voluntary choice of Civilian himself. Remembering all this, the guy exhales heavily, believing that it was pure hell. However, there is one thing that calms him down. He will receive his license tomorrow. He estimates in his head how much money he has left, and it is quite a decent amount. However, the guy recalls that it took him more than 3 years to save up so much. He earned this money in any way he could. In any way he could. And after everything that had been experienced, only this part remained due to the deduction of training camps. Civilian calculates how much he will have left for a rainy day, even if he spends minimally. But then he comes to the conclusion that it doesn't matter, and it's worth thinking about it after receiving a license. The next day, he goes to the hunter division with his country's abilities. Going inside, the guy starts to look around. There are quite a lot of people inside, and each of them is bustling about, doing their own thing. Having waited his turn, Civilian receives his long-awaited license, earned through sweat and blood. He asks himself that if he has this certificate, he will be able to hunt. Civilian vividly imagines what awaits him now, and the boy laughs maliciously. Seeing this from the outside, the department employee mentally assumes that this guy is quite emotional. Feeling someone watching him, Civilian turns around and their eyes meet. When a girl smiles, even if a little shyly, the guy comes to the conclusion that she is cute. Civilian suggests that they will be able to see each other more often if he becomes a hunter. Wondering whether to say hello to her, the guy wishes the girl a good day. She thanks him and reciprocates, politely asking him to survive. Although he understands the meaning of these words, at first they only cause bewilderment. Civilian thinks that after such a wish, goosebumps ran down his body. And then the guy suggests that it's time for him to take care of his weapon, because he simply has to survive. Later, entering the protected area, Civilian thinks that now everything will be for real. This is a hunting ground, and right in front of it there is a guard post for this place. One of the men asks Civilian whether he is a hunter, and he confirms this. Having checked the guy's ID, both guards saying that everything is fine, ask him to survive. As he leaves, Civilian thinks that these words make him nervous every time. Sometime later, rounding another bush, the guy remembers the training center. After all, if he understood everything correctly, horned rabbits should be found in this place. Civilian considers this monster to be the most suitable for beginners like him. The guy remembers that these guys usually form groups of 3 or 4 individuals, and this does not seem like anything particularly difficult. However, he also remembers that if you disturb them, you will experience all the cruelty and be impaled on a horn. Civilian regrets that he didn't take a shield, although at the same time, the guy didn't have enough money for one. He looks around to see if there is anyone next to him, and then he says the magic words to create the desired item. The process starts instantly, immersing Civilian in an already familiar atmosphere. His eyes are already beginning to reflect the beginnings of the weapon that is emerging in his hands. It turns out to be a pistol, and not a simple one, but a plasma one. Civilian thinks about it. Despite its simple design, this weapon actually does its job well when it comes to effectiveness. Civilian thinks that it took him 20 energy crystals to create this guy. After finishing admiring his toy, he brings up the item's status window. He receives information about the creation of the pistol and also studies its characteristics. The system's words about the weapon's poor design trigger Civilian, since he invested a lot of money into it. The guy thinks that the remaining money is clearly not enough for him to survive. However, now is not the time to think about this, and he needs to act, so he continues on his way. A man's voice comes from ahead, giving a command, and Civilian freezes. These are hunters without abilities, and the guy understands that they have a hard time. Also, since there are many people in this group, when dividing, the final amount of money for each person will be small. Civilian understands perfectly well that if he accidentally disturbs them, it could come back to haunt him. This is not some kind of game, and he should be extremely careful. Civilian doesn't even have time to finish his thought because of what he sees in front of him. The guy can't believe his luck because he sees 3 rabbits in front of him at once. He is confident that this is more than enough. But first, he wants to make a single shot. With these thoughts, the guy points his new gun at these crumbs and decisively pulls the trigger. A bluish light emanates from the muzzle, just as it did when the weapon was first created. And the blaster projectile, propelled by the mechanism, quickly leaves the compartment. And it's not just a shot, but an explosion. And it turns out to be quite impressively powerful. This comes as a surprise to Civilian, and he wonders if it was too powerful. But it was just as the guy wanted. A single shot that attracted the attention of these two. Turning sharply, they find their relative's killer with their gaze and begin to snort angrily. Realizing he's in trouble, Civilian comes to the conclusion that he needs to kill the rabbits before they get any closer. Thinking that he has no defense, the guy understands that everything needs to be done in one blow. When the rabbits pounce on him, Civilian tells himself to stop standing there like a pillar, and indeed he succeeds. The guy makes a second shot. He hits the target right on target, and the last remaining rabbit begins to growl even more angrily. But he too suffers the same fate as his brothers, and Civilian's shots prove surprisingly accurate. The guy is amazed at himself, breathing heavily and admitting that it was quite exciting. Wondering if that's all there is to it, he agrees that these monsters are just the thing for practice. Civilian likes this start to the hunt and decides to continue it, calling the rabbits stupid in the process. After all, these monsters are running towards him, even realizing what such consequences will lead to. This is precisely what Civilian considers the height of stupidity, watching the rabbits die. But even if this is true, the guy does not intend to stop there. He continues to destroy horned rabbits because, in addition, it is excellent training for him. Civilian's movements become more confident each time, and his aim becomes better. And at some point, realizing that he's had enough, the guy says that the training wasn't in vain for him. Civilian points out that this has allowed him to slightly improve his accuracy. His biggest concerns were about handling weapons with care, but he thinks everything else is fine. The guy figures that if he weren't too greedy, he could support himself by hunting horned rabbits for the rest of his life. But he believes that he cannot do this. And yet he admits the possibility that he might want to do this someday. Thinking that he has obtained the ability, Civilian says that he is not going to settle for a low rank. With the thought that he must try to improve his rank, the boy returns to his home. Civilian's habits have also changed since he started training. And before continuing with his daily business, the guy eats. Only after this does he pour out the loot collected from the horned rabbits in front of him. And he is amazed at how much he managed to obtain, although he does not believe that he did it himself, alone. As he begins to count everything, Civilian notes that he now has 12 crystals. He estimates that the minimum cost of just one is no less than 300,000. Having calculated how much it would cost if he sold all of this at least for the minimum, the guy was taken aback. This puzzles him because previously, to save even a third of this amount, he had to put in a lot of effort. Civilian is so confused that for a while he doesn't even know what to do. The guy thinks that with this money he can afford everything he could only dream of before. A tempting thought about spending some money today comes into his head. But Civilian stops himself. He forces himself to remember that he must be the best, because he wants to live with his head held high. The work of a hunter in this world is very hard work. Although from the outside everything seems extremely simple, this is far from the case. This is not a game, and any mistake immediately leads any hunter to death. This is precisely why you should always plan your actions in advance. Fatigue after battles also poses a huge danger to a hunter. Everyone needs rest, because without it, there will be no successful hunt. So hunters treat the wounds received in battle. Mages meditate to restore their powers lost in battle. Plan, caution, and rest are the three most important points in the life of every hunter. Civilian thinks that if he had followed what he was taught at the training center, he would not have stopped at just hunting. Taking all this into account, he mentally boldly calls himself a madman. And then he thinks what would have happened if he had done everything the same way as everyone else. He remembers being in despair, but now he has a purpose. Civilian wants to live his life freely. He doesn't want to live like an ordinary extra. Having received the opportunity to get ahead in life, the guy intends to rise higher and higher. He intends to destroy all obstacles in his path with his own hands and surpass everyone. He thinks that he is going to continue on his own path. And to achieve this, Civilian developed one strategy. He's going to try to carry it out right now by absorbing all these crystals. And while he sees that he is succeeding, under the influence of his power, the stones begin to melt before his eyes. When this process is completely completed, the glow moves from the palms to the guy's entire body. This continues for a few moments, after which everything gradually begins to calm down. Slowly opening his eyes, Civilian first of all moves them to his hands. When he sees that they are empty and look quite ordinary, he expresses an assumption. Civilian says he hopes everything worked out as it should. By voicing the name of his ability, the guy brings up the status window. He checks to see if his level has increased and chuckles thoughtfully, realizing that it hasn't. However, one of the lines particularly attracts Civilian's attention, even causing him to cry out in shock. Sometime later, he goes hunting again. While collecting his loot, the boy says he finds it terrifying that he can't drag the bodies away. Civilian believes that he needs to hunt more because he won't be able to rank up without the required amount of crystals. Thinking that he needs to move on, the guy remembers that there is something else he wants to do. But in order to achieve this, it is necessary to change the trajectory. As he moves forward, Civilian notices strange sounds and curiosity gets the better of him. However, as he gets closer, the guy begins to feel like he's doing this in vain. And indeed, the next bell rings when he sees the creature in front of him. The realization dawns on the guy belatedly, but he can no longer do anything about it. The next thing that catches his eye is this picture. Well, the horned rabbit, even turning to look at the stranger, continues to chomp loudly. Civilian realizes that this creature is one of the strongest monsters. An involuntary, overly loud sound escapes from the guy, and the monster immediately reacts to it. Civilian freezes, afraid to even breathe, but it is too late for that. Turning his face towards the guy, the horned rabbit begins to growl. Civilian remains in place for literally a couple of moments, after which the instinct of self-preservation takes over. At exactly the same second, the guy suddenly turns on his heels and starts running as fast as he can. But no matter how quickly he does it, the creature is not much inferior to him. It breathes almost down his back. Civilian can almost feel its foul breath. At some point, the guy wonders if all he can do is run. A smirk appears on his lips as Civilian tells himself that this is not true. Reminding himself of his own words about wanting to become stronger, the boy shoots while running. The last thing the mutant rabbit sees before being hit by the projectile is a bluish light. And then the space around is washed over by the now familiar explosion, and Civilian peers into its depths. Trying to find the silhouette of the mutant rabbit with his eyes, the guy wonders if he succeeded. Because of such dense smoke, it is impossible to see anything for quite a long time. However, at some point, something red appears from the dense haze, and then the creature bursts into such a thunderous roar that Civilian had never heard from it before. Understanding perfectly well what is about to happen, the guy starts to curse, but stops himself. The horned rabbit isn't just going to gore him with his horn. He's planning to do it in the most brutal way possible. Continuing to fill its horn with magical energy, the creature makes Civilian tense up considerably. He had heard of something similar, so he began to pray to God that it wouldn't affect him. When the magically charged blast fires, the boy somehow actually manages to dodge it. Straightening up a little to see better, Civilian breathes heavily, his heart pounding in his ears. Seeing this in front of him, the guy sinks. Thoughts arise in his head that do not make him happy at all. Meanwhile, the rabbit appears before his eyes again, and Civilian thinks about its special ability. This doesn't make the guy happy at all, so he rushes away, not intending to compete with such a person. And yet, there is a voice in his head calling on Civilian to do something. Due to his haste, the boy's hands shake, which causes his next mistake. He loses quite a few crystals on the run and stops to figure out what to do next. His stupor lasts for a few moments, during which the guy finds a solution. He thinks that he doesn't care about the crystals, because staying alive is much more important now. And then Civilian, as usual, says the words that activate his ability. At the moment the process starts, the guy mentally rushes it, wanting to speed up time. However, contrary to Civilian's wishes, something completely different happens. At first, everything looks the same as before, except for one anomaly. However, the very next moment, for some unknown reason, the crystals are not absorbed but are crushed. Civilian is perplexed, thinking about the reason for this and the fact that something like this has never happened before. The guy tries to come up with a new plan of action because this radically changes the situation. And behind him, the familiar glow appears again, causing Civilian to panic even more. The guy starts to feel angry and starts swearing, clicking his tongue. Seeing no point in standing in one place and continuing his tirade, he swears again. Civilian tries to make sense of things like why everything happened now. He doesn't understand what he did wrong. And what should he do now? Should he give up? However, now it's against his own rules, because the guy has finally found a purpose in his life. So, refusing to give up completely, he makes the exchange again using his ability. This time, the transformation does not concern the items he is accustomed to, but equipment in general. For the very next moment, these shoes appear on Civilian's feet, and the guy happily notes that he managed to realize his idea. From this angle, he does not see his opponent as he sees himself. So the guy turns to the rabbit and asks him where he is now. Then, Civilian decides to try out his new shoes and activates them at the same moment. And this happens at the perfect time, because the very next moment the rabbit appears nearby. Watching the creature from above, the guy mentally expresses satisfaction. He also expresses to himself the hope that such a distance is safe for him. Well, the angry and insulted beast continues to gnash its teeth. Civilian says that he has two paths, the first of which is to escape, and the second is to catch the monster. Asking himself what to choose, the guy doesn't take long to come up with an answer. He believes the answer is obvious and activates his ability the very next moment. And after this, the blaster we are already familiar with appears in the guy's hands. At this time, the rabbit continues to carefully observe its victim, following its every movement. Meanwhile, Civilian begins his descent, reflected in the creature's eyes. To relax, the guy takes a few deep breaths, and all this time he is rapidly and inexorably approaching the earth. He has very little time left before he collides with his opponent. However, before this happens, Civilian's lips stretch into a satisfied grin. Smiling, pleased with himself, the guy dodges and says that it was too slow. The beast continues to rage, seemingly becoming even more angry. Because of the haze that has formed around him, it is not possible for him to see anything. But from his height, Civilian has an excellent view of his target, and he does not hesitate. Pointing his weapon at the rabbit, the boy tells him to return to the underworld. The area around the place where the projectile hits is enveloped in a familiar explosion. However, the rabbit is still not affected and bursts into a loud roar. But Civilian doesn't see this as a big problem, finding the shot to be quite good, and releasing a series of several more after it. The guy wonders if he has now managed to kill the creature. As the smoke begins to clear, Civilian notices outlines emerging through it, and then the guy begins to slowly descend, getting closer to the rabbit. He can hardly believe that he was actually able to do this. Civilian is delighted with this turn of events. However, the very next moment he is literally at a loss, not knowing what to do with it. Continuing to examine the rabbit's carcass, the guy still can't believe what happened. He also constantly turns over in his head the question of what he should do. Taking out his phone, Civilian remembers that he can ask for a reward for this creature, and he still decides to do just that, calling the appropriate place for further instructions. The woman who answered him was in no hurry, speaking her greeting in a measured manner. Listening attentively to her interlocutor, she never interrupts him, only thoughtfully omitting an interjection. And then, the woman expresses satisfaction and agreement with what her interlocutor said. Saying that he will receive his reward, the employee asks Civilian to stay put. Hanging up, the woman says that everything is exactly as she thought. Descending from her seat as leisurely as usual, she takes a few steps forward, and then, stretching, the woman says that it is a good time to go for a walk to a certain place. Closing his eyes, the guy takes a deep breath, concentrating on his sensations. At some point, he suddenly opens them and his gaze becomes determined. The next moment, a wooden training sword cuts through the air in front of him. This movement is so intense that the guy even starts sweating. He leans forward, but his movements are precise and flexible. His hands skillfully grip the handle. It is clear that he has been involved in this sport for a long time. Before moving on to the next stage, the guy makes a few practice moves, cutting through the air in front of him. The man sitting on the window watches him closely, although he doesn't show any particular interest. On the contrary, at some point he becomes so bored that he yawns. A sensitive ear picks up some sound behind the wall, forcing one to turn one's gaze towards the door. And indeed, it opens exactly the next moment. A woman who appeared at the threshold greeted those present, noting that they had not seen each other for a long time. When no one answers her, the woman, without saying another word, calmly approaches her interlocutors. One of them asks if something has happened again, while the other remains patiently silent. The woman confirms the guess, saying that something needs to be delivered from somewhere. Her interlocutor clicks his tongue in displeasure, stating that there will be trouble again. The woman politely asks to pay due attention to this, reminding that something interesting might come across. The guy agrees unconditionally, suggesting that his partner first get ready. Checking the time, Civilian notes out loud that it is already a bit late. However, he still does not lose hope for the best, continuing to wait. So much time passes and Civilian thinks about leaving. But even when he strains himself, he curses and reassures himself that he can handle everything. At that moment, when a familiar sound begins to be heard from somewhere above, the guy twitches. Knowing exactly who it belongs to, Civilian raises his head. He is amazed that a helicopter has arrived in such a place, he says out loud. The light turns out to be so unbearably bright that Civilian expresses dissatisfaction about it. And yet, at some point, his eyes manage to successfully adjust. Looking closely at the outlines available to him, Civilian makes out the silhouettes of two people. The guy with purple hair, in turn, peers at the one standing below. His partner does the same, but with much more lively interest. However, despite all this, they still do not descend, as if they are calculating something in their heads. And indeed, the helicopter moves its searchlight, picking out the figure of a horned rabbit from the darkness. The blonde is uncontrollably delighted, asking inquiringly if this is really it. His gaze is already glowing not only with anticipation when he suggests to his partner that they go down. He responds with a calm and monosyllabic agreement, and the very next moment they both jump off fearlessly, as if this was a normal thing for them. Seeing them do this, Civilian is amazed, asking how they fly in the air. Meanwhile, these guys land on the ground so casually, as if this action is nothing special. Not knowing how to start a conversation, Civilian hums, and the purple-haired boy takes the initiative. While he says they are from the lab, his partner takes off again. He stops literally a few centimeters from the horned rabbit, starting to ooh and ah in delight. The boy continues to be amazed at who exactly this creature turned out to be. Civilian feels awkward at this, again losing the ability to speak clearly. The blonde's partner, letting out a sympathetic sigh, pulls him back, and even though he says that this shouldn't be done, his voice remains calm. The boy turns around sharply to ask the elder about the reason for this. He says that it is indecent and tells the blonde to apologize, but he only clicks his tongue in displeasure. Civilian still feels awkward and wonders in his mind if he is the third wheel here. When the purple-haired guy apologizes, he says that it's not a big deal because the guy is still a child. However, he flares up when he hears something like this about himself and hotly objects. Civilian, at least mentally, stands his ground, considering his interlocutor a real child. Looking at the purple-haired boy, he remembers that he has seen this face somewhere before. As he replays the memories of the last few days in his mind, he finally remembers. For a few moments, the guy is overcome with doubts, but he still accepts this fact. The next moment, he is delighted, thinking that he did not expect to meet this man under such circumstances. Civilian does not leave the scene of action, continuing to observe everything closely. When the carcass of the horned rabbit is taken away, he wonders if everything is really that simple. This irritates the guy. He thinks that he doesn't like what's happening here at all, and then Civilian is politely told that it looks like he will have to go into the lab with them, because they are encountering something like this for the first time, and everything needs to be thoroughly investigated. Civilian asks if he has to go, and his interlocutor says that it would be better that way. The guy sees no other reasonable options but to agree, and then Thanking him for his understanding, his interlocutor snaps his fingers. At that moment, Civilian is caught by a gust of wind and rises into the air. The purple-haired boy follows suit, his expression calm again. The younger one also doesn't lag behind them, rushing into the air with even greater zeal. Realizing that words would be unnecessary now, Civilian tries to get used to the new sensations in silence. Even when he is already inside, he talks about the ability to fly through the air. And at the same time, Civilian is thinking about this boy's abilities. The purple-haired guy tells him that they are taking off, and he accepts it. Civilian is puzzled by the boy's behavior, because he starts giggling. The rest of the journey to the laboratory is silent, accompanied only by the sounds inherent to the helicopter itself. After some time, they finally approach the required building, and Civilian, looking out the window, looks at him with all his eyes, admiring him. He admires the scale of the building, now knowing exactly what the laboratory looks like. Meanwhile, the helicopter, approaching the required site, begins its descent, and below, a woman we know is already waiting for them, eager to see the catch. Naturally, the first thing that happens is that the carcass of a horned rabbit lands on the platform with a characteristic sound. Looking at the face looking out the window, the woman notes that she has seen it somewhere before. The first thing the blonde guy does is jump out of the helicopter, practically running and diving down. His landing is spectacular and resounding. But the boy doesn't plan on staying here for long. As soon as the others land on a solid surface, the blonde runs away. At this time, Civilian is watching the boy and, seeing where exactly he ran up to, lets out an admiring interjection. Noticing the woman, he comments on her beauty and wonders if she really works in the laboratory. The boy asks his interlocutor if they can go, but she says that she will still need their help. The blonde man, sighing heavily, says that it seems they have no other choice. The woman, noticing Civilian's gaze, greets him with a charming smile. Introducing herself as the lab director, Crystal King, she asks for a little more time. The guy agrees, thinking that it's already quite late and he can stay, and the woman expresses respectful gratitude to him for his understanding. When the purple-haired boy glances at Crystal, she nods confidently. The blonde, also noticing this silent exchange, swallows nervously, and then turns to Civilian. Before asking the guy to follow him, he experiences noticeable difficulty. Since these words are difficult for the blonde, he tries to repeat them louder and more confidently. Civilian suggests that the boy has difficulty communicating with people and is not himself without his friend. Our hero asks if he is really going to show him the building now, and his interlocutor says that there is no one else. Then Civilian expresses his consent to this and allows the younger one to accompany him. A smile appears on Crystal's lips as she thinks about how fun this looks like. Later, she asks her interlocutor about the ability of their new acquaintance. When he confirms that he didn't understand and the body was already empty when it was discovered, Crystal begins to analyze. Her interlocutor admits to her that he finds this very surprising. The woman accompanies her manipulations with words about an empty body and a bullet wound. The guy says that although he is not sure, most likely this hunter could have hidden the pistol. Crystal chuckles thoughtfully, then says that some things are missing inside. Her interlocutor believes that there are plenty of unclear points in this, and the woman agrees with him. She starts talking about a gun that leaves such holes behind. The guy keeps up the conversation. Crystal admits that this task turned out to be completely different from what she expected. When she starts to wonder about ways to solve it, the guy says that it is not up to him to decide. In response to such words, the woman mentally calls him callous, and out loud she suggests that she will have to go and talk to this guy in person. At this time, Civilian allows his guide not to speak to him formally, and he is surprised. Calling his interlocutor Good, the boy introduces himself as Shine. Civilian is amazed that this guy only introduced himself when he realized that he was Good, and he agrees. He is amazed at what appears before him, because he expected to see something like a restroom. However, contrary to expectations, Civilian finds himself in a place that resembles a training hall. Moreover, the zones located in this place are very different. It is not just an arena for sparring. There are also exercise machines here, the kind you would find in a regular gym. Civilian, thinking that he did not expect to be treated specially, considers asking a question. He doesn't think about it for long, almost immediately turning to Shine, who responds. In response to his question, Civilian receives the answer that the guys are, by and large, in this place. The guy cautiously points out that guests are usually brought to living rooms, and Shine replies that he hates them. Civilian tries to understand the reason for this, suggesting that it is all about Shine's age, but he gets an answer pretty quickly. The boy says that girls are tormenting him in the living rooms. Civilian is amazed by this, not quite understanding what exactly his interlocutor means. Shine responds to this as well, explaining that these girls are tormenting him by constantly telling him how cute he is. Civilian interprets this as bragging and asks a question accordingly, but Shine is completely serious when he says that he is tired of being constantly groped and held tightly. But Civilian doesn't see this as a tragedy, and on the contrary, the boy considers the younger one a lucky, impudent fellow. As he sits down on the edge of the ring, there is silence between them for a moment. Then Civilian asks if Crystal is too young to be a director. The blonde guy, starting to grin, in turn inquires about the reason for such interest. And from his words, Civilian learns that Crystal is a true genius. He continues by talking about rumors that the laboratory was created thanks to this girl. Shine says that Crystal is a cunning witch who makes everyone do the most unpleasant tasks. The boy ends his tirade by saying that he doesn't like it at all. Humming thoughtfully, Civilian praises Shine's ability, but Shine says there's nothing special about it. Observing the younger boy's reaction, the boy concludes that he is susceptible to compliments. At some point, Shine suddenly jumps up, glancing towards the door. The next moment there is a knock on the door, and Civilian mentally rejoices that these guys have finally arrived. And indeed, the door opened and let in the one he expected to see. Giggling sweetly, Crystal politely asks Civilian if they can talk for a bit. Later, in a completely different place, several explosions are heard. Their initiator is none other than Civilian with his favorite blaster gun. Following the first series of shots, several more are heard, leaving behind only smoke. When it clears, Civilian notes that he has caught some big game today. While he collects crystals, there is perfect silence around him. However, at some point, two lights flash behind the guy, which he does not notice at first. However, everything changes the moment massive, sharp claws cut through the air. Although Civilian reacts late, he manages to protect his face with his hand. Yes, it was not possible to avoid injuries, but this minimized the damage caused. Meanwhile, the creature that did this is approaching, emitting a guttural roar. At this time, Civilian slowly backs away, trying not to provoke the predator prematurely. But this doesn't work for long, because the next moment the creature takes off. Civilian suddenly snatches his weapon from his belt, hastily pulling the trigger. However, it takes some time for the gun to load before the shot can be fired. Unfortunately, this does not happen, as the creature makes a jump. She bites into the blaster, biting through it and causing it to make a plaintive crackling sound. However, despite this, Civilian refuses to let go of his only weapon, and a fight ensues between the two. To somehow even the score, the guy kicks the dog, knocking it away. And then he sits down carefully while she closes the distance between them again. The dog runs towards the hunter, growling angrily, wanting to sink its teeth into its prey as quickly as possible. As he gets closer, his barking gets louder. But Civilian isn't about to play along. When there are only a couple of meters left between them, the guy activates his gun. He calculates the timing precisely so that it doesn't turn out like last time. However, there is another moment where Civilian does miscalculate, and that is the dog's movement itself. Since the guy had plenty of time, he takes another shot, but it also turns out to be unsuccessful. Luck is not on his side. The dog is already very close, and he is even more furious. When Civilian tries to pull the trigger for the third time, his body begins to tremble out of fear of death. And yet the guy refuses to give up, desperately clinging to his life. He shoots straight into the creature's mouth, telling it to die. Realization flashes in the crazy eyes only for a moment, after which the inevitable happens. Civilian manages to pull away just a moment before the explosion, and the dog's body falls at his feet. Finally, the guy lets out a sigh of relief, allowing himself to exhale the tension that had built up inside. He continues to breathe heavily for a long time, trying to bring his ragged breathing back to normal. Civilian notes that, having gone a little further than he should have, he immediately came across this hound. The guy says that he is incredibly lucky, because usually such individuals flock together in packs. He guesses that this one was probably just kicked out, and lets out another long, drawn-out breath. Civilian thinks that he needs to rest just a little bit, because he almost went to the other world. But to do this, it is necessary to find a safer area, which is what the guy does. Finding such a place, Civilian makes a stop and settles down, exhaling heavily. He says that luck is not on his side today. While stress eating, at first Civilian doesn't even pay attention to the sound coming from his pocket. However, he repeats himself, causing the guy to chuckle in surprise. Civilian is amazed that there is a network in this place and notices new messages. When he opens it, he doesn't really expect to see anything impressive. But he's wrong. Seeing the amount that the laboratory transferred to him, the guy cannot contain his stunned question. Remembering the conversation that took place some time ago, Civilian wonders if perhaps he should have turned down Crystal. After this, the guy's thoughts return to the moment when the girl invited him to talk. Civilian immediately agreed at that moment, to which Shine clicked his tongue in displeasure. Crystal let them through first, and then she followed behind. A little later, having moved the chair to sit more comfortably, the girl took it. Civilian then, noticing that Crystal was wearing a skirt, mentally resented the fact that it was against the rules. Meanwhile, she apologized for being late and asked how long he had been waiting for her. She didn't raise her head until the guy said that everything was okay. Crystal smiled her signature smile and asked if he really forgave her. Civilian agreed, wondering how one could not forgive. The girl clarified some points regarding the capture of the horned rabbit and expressed her assumptions. Civilian agreed that he had tried his best and shared some details of the story. He admitted that catching the creature turned out to be extremely difficult, as he risked his own life. Hearing these words, Crystal asked if she could make him one proposal in that case. The guy was surprised by this, not fully understanding what she wanted from him. But he still allowed it. And then Crystal asked him if he wanted to work together. In the present, remembering everything that happened to him, Civilian thinks that he is still alive only thanks to luck. He can't stop thinking about it, imagining what would have happened if he had made even the slightest mistake. Civilian's fantasy paints the consequences of this very vividly. He imagines it incredibly clearly, even hearing the characteristic crunching sound in his ears. The guy understands perfectly well that at that very moment, he would lose what he has now found a craving for. And by saying he can't stop them, Civilian notes that he considers this a problem. He thinks that monsters need to be stopped by someone, like hunters with physical strength, or like others, whose special abilities lie in the opposite direction. Stopping, Civilian silently ponders this topic for some time, and then he starts talking about what exactly his problem was. Civilian is sure that it lies in his inability to cope with monsters. The guy thinks that he needs something that could stop them at the right moment. He wants to create something like a shield or get an ability that allows him to do so. Turning his head from side to side to assess the situation, Civilian notes that nothing has changed here. A familiar administrator asks how she can help Mr. Hunter. If he wants to sell the crystals, Civilian mentally notes that the people in this place are, as always, friendly. Feeling a little embarrassed, the guy asks if it is possible to buy crystals here. The girl confirms this and asks if she should take him inside for a demonstration. With a sigh of relief, Civilian politely agrees. When the heavy door opens and they find themselves inside the desired room, the guy begins to look around. What appears before his eyes puzzles him a little, because he does not see any crystals yet. However, unable to contain his exclamation of admiration, the guy thinks that this seems to be what he needs. Amazed by the size of the weapon, Civilian allows for the thought that this is a common practice for strongmen. He remembers that the hunter Clea carried a rather long sword with him. As the guy is deep in his own thoughts, he flinches when he hears a polite greeting behind him. The young man who approached him apologized to the client for making him wait. Hearing the words that he did not warn about the meeting in advance, Civilian is surprised. But then he quickly adapts, promising that next time he will warn of his arrival. The sophisticated young man laughs, saying that this is not at all necessary, although it has become something of a tradition. The consultant clarifies, noting that Civilian was looking at swords, whether he would like to purchase this weapon. The guy denies it, saying he came to look at something else. And while the consultant is thinking about his words, he begins to rummage through his pockets. Civilian asks if it is possible to purchase crystals like these from them. Noting that this item is of the lowest class, the man answers in the affirmative. Civilian breathes a sigh of relief and expresses joy about this, both out loud and in his mind. Confirming that he wants the lowest class, he asks how much it will cost. Before answering, the young man begins to hesitate a little. Civilian is amazed to hear the price and says that the market he knows has completely different prices. The consultant explains that the government set this price, and a commission is charged when selling the crystals. These words mislead Civilian, and he asks again in dismay, again receiving an identical answer, and the consultant begins to explain in detail what makes up this price. This does not suit Civilian at all, and he begins to be indignant to himself. However, exhaling heavily, the guy comes to the conclusion that nothing can be done about it, since the government has decided so. Thinking that the consultant has nothing to do with it, Civilian is going to simply leave, because it is too expensive for him. When he says goodbye to the consultant, the latter politely apologizes. Of course, Civilian leaves the treasured room with an unpleasant feeling of disappointment. But it's not time to be sad, and the guy starts to figure out exactly how many crystals he needs. He thinks that when he creates any object, he already intuitively knows how many crystals he needs to create it. Imagining that he will have to hunt again, the guy says that he is already seriously tired of it. Unfortunately, nothing can be done about this. So the guy continues to pursue his goal. Sometime later, he looks at the crystals he had obtained with bloody sweat, holding them very carefully. The guy reminds himself that all this is necessary in order to rise to the top. Closing his eyes, he takes a deep breath and says the words that start the now familiar process. The next moment, the room is also habitually illuminated by a bright light, which becomes even brighter until the process is completely completed. When the object in his hands finally crackles with static, the guy brings it closer to his eyes. Civilian wonders if he succeeded in realizing his plan. He calls this device a nanowire, believing that it will make him stronger. The guy thinks that, according to the plan, it will be enough to just point out the target to him. Wanting to try out his new weapon, Civilian wonders if he should use it here. At the same time, he thinks that he needs to save money. And this catch wasn't very good. But the guy also remembers that he will have to pay for this room in any case. And yet he encourages himself, saying that it's all nonsense and he will definitely pay for everything. And the very next moment, Civilian throws the nanowire at the chosen target with all his might. The device begins to transform on the fly as it moves. And then the extended legs hit the wall with a corresponding sound, and the mechanism is activated. When the device works exactly as it should, Civilian mentally rejoices. Happy that he succeeded, the boy approaches the nanowire network closer, wanting to examine it more closely. He says he finds the device quite good, and then, realizing that this is enough for now, Civilian begins to remove his network. It disappears gradually with a corresponding hissing sound, and then the guy sighs heavily, because he hears disgruntled knocks from the other side of the wall. Sometime later, as he picks up his backpack, he thinks about the need to conduct a real test. Remembering his past experience, the guy thinks that he would really like to catch the hound. He thinks everyone knows that this species is descended from a hunting dog. They usually live in packs, but the individual Civilian recently encountered seemed to have strayed from its group. Although hounds drop the lowest grade crystals, hunters avoid them. But this is not surprising, because these creatures move in flocks of several dozen individuals. Civilian is distracted from his thoughts by a familiar bark, and he mentally notes that he has found those he was looking for. Before acting, the guy looks out for his prey, watching it for a while. After this, his lips involuntarily stretch into a grin due to the desire to start as soon as possible. Civilian does not lose heart, even when he thinks that he might not succeed, because there is a way out. And with these thoughts, the guy activates his ability with a corresponding crack. At that very moment, his jet boots appear on his feet, and then Civilian reaches into his pocket with crystals, starting the transformation right in the process, and literally a moment later, the nanowire we are already familiar with appears in his hand. The guy begins to approach the pack, not really hiding his presence, and this makes one of the dogs start listening, after which he lets out a warning growl. The very next moment, the creature notices the uninvited guest and begins to bark loudly, alerting its relatives about him. They immediately follow his advice and, joining in with a frenzied barking, rush at the enemy. Civilian hesitates just long enough to allow the hounds to get close enough to successfully carry out his maneuver. But immediately after this, he notes out loud the fact that it is time to begin, and he throws the nanowire right under the feet of the approaching dogs, skillfully calculating the trajectory. The network of devices is removed the moment each of the drones hits the ground. Dogs use various methods to get out, including barking and whining. They desperately try to get rid of the ill-fated object, but nothing works. Civilian, hearing these disparate sounds, lets out a sigh of relief, and then the guy slowly closes the distance between himself and the monsters and fires several shots at once. The moment the volley hits its first target, Civilian feels a sense of security. This is followed by thoughts that it will now be easier for him to hunt. But the remaining dogs stubbornly continue to behave aggressively, trying to reach their opponent. However, the very next moment they suffer exactly the same fate as their brothers just recently. And at the moment when he manages to deal with everyone, the guy recalls his network. When it begins to dissolve, there is nothing left underneath it except lower-level crystals. While collecting them, at some point, Civilian squeezes one of them. After he collects everything, the guy puts the backpack back on his shoulders. A satisfied smile involuntarily appears on his lips, and Civilian asks if he really succeeded. A muffled sound of a familiar ringtone comes from the backpack, and the guy is surprised by it. A few moments later, Civilian sees that he is receiving a call from the Universe Laboratory. He accepts the challenge almost immediately, without thinking anything through, greeting his interlocutor in the standard way, and he hears him say that he has a request for him, and it is very urgent. Civilian is puzzled by this and asks what the request is and what happened. Crystal reiterates her words about how incredibly urgent this matter is, and then she clarifies whether Civilian's promise to fulfill her request is still valid. The guy tries to find out what exactly his interlocutor means, straining even more. The girl plays it out the way she wants, saying that since everything is still in force, she will send the guys to him. But she still remembers politeness, admitting that first she needs to explain everything. She briefly says that a person's life is at stake and asks them to do as they are told. These words do not particularly encourage the guy, and he tries to analyze the words of the laboratory director. Thinking that the man might die, Civilian comes to the conclusion that he simply has no choice. However, the guy honestly admits that if it becomes too dangerous, he can run away. Crystal says it's no big deal, but asks him to save the man. The girl says goodbye by saying that Shine and Clea will explain everything to him in more detail. Civilian is considering asking them to pay him with crystals. At some point, a distant sound is heard in the completely calm and quiet sky. Civilian's companions begin to approach him inexorably. They fly fast, but even from this height, Clea manages to notice a prominent dot below. As he descends a little, he hears Shine's clarifying question about whether this is the one they need. Civilian can also already distinguish dots in the sky, and he understands who it is by the speed of approach and the characteristic sound. The very next moment, the boy makes a movement with his hand, directing the flow of air towards the guy. And still, he is surprised when a gust of wind picks him up and he screams. Shine, with his usual impulsiveness, says that they must move out immediately. Civilian is not happy about this either, and he manages to ask if they won't even let him in on the matter. The teenager, with uncharacteristic seriousness, says that this matter is too urgent. Clea's first words at this meeting are to encourage her companions to get to work. Civilian doesn't like this arrangement, so he asks the guys to explain themselves right away. However, his interlocutors masterfully ignore him. But at some point, Shine says that it is here. At first, Civilian asks in confusion what is here, but then it dawns on him. What he sees makes the guy let out a cry of admiration and make him think. He assumes that this time they will have to fight the mutant again. This creature is called a metal slime, but it is usually the size of human legs. Civilian asks if they can catch the mutant, and Shine honestly says he doesn't know. He adds that if they fail, they should simply rescue the person and let him escape. At first, Civilian doesn't see anyone, but then he takes a closer look at the area. The guy mentally assumes that this girl does not have a partner, but he is not sure about this. Meanwhile, the metal slime goes into offensive mode. The huntress barely manages to jump away from him at the very last moment, clicking her tongue in displeasure. She breathes heavily from exhaustion, but still finds the strength to resist. Leaning forward, the girl not only jumps, but also shoots sparks at the metal slime. At first, the bright light makes it impossible to see anything, but the huntress still desperately peers at the fruit of her creation. And yet, disappointment awaits her, because none of the attacks were able to cause a drop of damage to the mutant. Realizing her mistake fully, the girl groans in disappointment. The next moment, her opponent attempts to attack her again, but the huntress stubbornly stands her ground. And then, seeing that she can't cope, Shine steps in, flying closer. He turns to his partners, urging them to go and rescue the girl as quickly as possible. And they obey, not intending to leave the huntress in trouble, nor to abandon their youngest. Suddenly, Clea surges forward, quickly overtaking Civilian and Shine. His gaze becomes incredibly serious and confident. He literally glows with determination. While still walking, the guy reaches for his sword, not intending to hesitate. He grips both the scabbard and the hilt tightly, beginning to imbue the weapon with his power. With this attitude, he steps forward, drawing his sword the very next moment. With just one swing, Clea cuts the metal slime in half. With a corresponding sound, the mutant begins to fall onto its side, spreading out like jelly. Civilian, watching this spectacle, thinks that it is incredible. After all, no matter how attentive he was, he still couldn't see the movement of this guy's sword. Civilian is even taken aback by how impressive Clea's abilities are. However, his thoughts are interrupted as suddenly as they began. The metal slime, which has fallen to its side and is almost separated, begins to wobble. And then something starts to happen to it. The smaller part seems to increase in size, and so it happens. Shaking and trembling, the smaller part of the metal slime reaches the size of the larger one. Clea frowned in displeasure, because he was the one to blame for all of this. His partners, too, realizing what had just happened, became tense. The huntress looks no less puzzled, having no idea what to do since there are now two mutants. Standing before her two opponents, Clea tries to collect her thoughts. The guy is breathing heavily, because it took quite a lot of effort to carry out his previous blow. Civilian sighs heavily, remembering that last time there was lightning. And now there is generation with division. Abruptly changing his mood, the guy begins to remember everything he knows about metal slimes. It comes to mind that although these monsters are of low class, they can use their bodies freely. And you can see this clearly right now. When the need to attack arises, they can turn part of their body into spikes and shoot them. Meanwhile, Clea has so far managed to successfully evade the all-destructive power of these very spikes. At some point, the guy jumps up, sharply raising his sword over his head. Intuitively sensing a threat, the metal slime transforms again. Civilian continues to remember what he knows about these mutants, realizing that he is hardened and is using his body as a shield. Therefore, Clea's blow does not reach its target, only hitting the super hard surface with a corresponding ringing sound. In order to avoid accidentally running into a surprise attack, the guy strategically retreats. His hand begins to shake from the strain as he mentally admits that this is a bit difficult. Also, despite the fact that these mutants are low-class monsters, they are really difficult to deal with. This is due to the large number of types of defenses and attacks they have. Clea wonders how many more times this creature can grow if she cuts it with a sword. Meanwhile, the metal slime changes its priority again, switching from defense to attack. Watching all this, Civilian chuckles thoughtfully, suggesting that he might have a limit. The only problem is that it is impossible to understand how many more times it will be divided before it reaches the limit. Clea thinks that until they come up with a plan of action, they need to drag things out as long as possible. And then he tries to perform a feint, using something like a dash. Unable to believe that nothing can be invented, Civilian asks the same question. Shine confirms these words, saying that by the time they got here, they had used up almost all their strength. Civilian asks his interlocutor not to tell him that he and Clea did not know that the metal slime could split. However, contrary to expectations, the boy answers negatively and becomes depressed. Civilian wonders if this technique is really necessary, and if these two always ended the hunt with it. Scratching his head thoughtfully, the boy asks if maybe they have no choice but to run. Shine asks what if they don't want it. Besides, Clea is the type that will try to win until the very end. Civilian himself sighs heavily, asking inquiringly whether this man really does not accept any defeats. Shine is silent for a moment before answering, but a very satisfied smile appears on his lips. Confirming Civilian's words, the boy begins to admire Clea, calling him incredibly cool. Seeing such servility, the guy assumes that Shine has a brother complex, but he quickly pulls himself together, because at the moment something else is much more important. Realizing that Clea won't be able to distract the monster forever, Civilian decides to go all in. Noticing the elder's sudden change in mood, Shine drops a puzzled question, and he, trying not to think about the possible consequences, activates his ability. Civilian decides it's time to give it his all and, if not win, then at least try to support Clea. The next moment, a plasma pistol appears in his left hand. The shoes on the feet are replaced with ones that are more effective in this situation. And of course, the guy sees no point in neglecting the nanowire. Shine suddenly transforms, asking if this is a spatial ability. Civilian allows him to think as he wishes, considering the capture of the monster as the first priority. And at that very moment, The guy confidently points his gun towards the slime and pulls the trigger. The projectile rushes into the distance with lightning speed, leaving behind an impressive trail. And at some point, when it reaches its target, the usual explosion occurs. It's hard for Shine to watch this, but Civilian is curious to know if he succeeded in his plan. Finally, the dust clears and he can see a familiar outline. But for now, the slime's status is still unknown. But at some point it happens, and it becomes clear that the idea has failed. Civilian swallows nervously, amazed that the metal slime can't be taken even with fire. However, the guy does not lose hope, planning to carry out another series of attacks. He sends several bullets after the first single one, not allowing the mutant to regroup. At first, when the bullet hits the same place, it seems as if nothing happened. However, if you look more closely, it becomes clear that this is not the case. Such an attack turns out to be effective. The metal slime simply breaks into many pieces, spreading throughout the area with the corresponding sounds. Making pitiful sounds, the mini versions of the mutant begin to crawl in different directions, wanting to survive. Shine says this thing will keep dividing until it's stopped completely. Civilians sighs heavily, calling the situation they find themselves in difficult. The guy starts turning his head, wanting to find Clea with his eyes. He still continues to fight with the unyielding part of the first slime. The guy wonders what he should do, because it doesn't look like Clea is going to give up. The hunter does not notice anything or anyone in the area, devoting all his last strength to this battle. Civilian believes that in such a situation they can retreat only if they try all possible means. And some of the metal slime parts are still falling down. They crawl away, either seeking salvation or in the hope of once again growing a powerful and invincible body. Observing this whole situation, Clea clicks her tongue in displeasure, calling it hopeless. Civilian asks if there is a way where it can be cut in one fell swoop. At that very moment, the footsteps of a girl whose existence the boys had already successfully forgotten were heard behind them. She begins to speak hesitantly, but the essence of her words is clear. The huntress says that it seems she can help them. Remembering that it was her they were saving, the boys were perplexed and silent for a while. And then Civilian asks the girl how exactly she can help, and whether she really knows some effective method. Looking down at the gun in the guy's hands, she begins to talk about this gun. The girl asks if it is electric because it doesn't seem normal at all. Civilian says that this is not entirely true, mentally adding that it is plasma. Hearing this answer, the girl becomes upset, absent-mindedly repeating the words that this gun does not have electricity. Civilian thinks that she is sweet, and that makes him want to listen to all her requests. And then the guy asks if electricity suddenly appears, will anything useful come of it? Before answering, the girl hesitates, but finally makes up her mind and speaks up. She says that her ability is related to electricity and adds, the girl could have done something if she had had any source of strong electricity. But suddenly she becomes determined, declaring that if that were the case, she would definitely do something about it. Civilian begins to look around for any source of electricity, but finds nothing. However, chuckling thoughtfully, he thinks that he does have some sort of idea after all. But at the same time, Civilian thinks that he is a low-level hunter and needs to be more careful. He considers this girl to be especially potentially dangerous, not knowing whether he can trust her at all. And this very girl at that moment rushes to Civilian and tightly squeezes his hands in hers. She asks emotionally if he really won't succeed at all. Civilian asks his interlocutor if she really wants to kill this monster so badly. Shine joins the conversation, reminding the girl that there is no electricity around. Hearing words about escape, the girl begins to shake and mumble something unintelligible, and then she loudly and clearly declares that she wants to win somehow. Looking more closely at the girl's face, Civilian realizes that her words are sincere, and then he pulls his hand out of the others and expresses understanding with the huntress's words. Placing his backpack on the ground, Civilian begins to carefully consider his next moves. Remembering Shine's words, the boy thinks that he can't let those present know what kind of ability he has. Civilian allows himself to reflect a little about the unknown girl and comes to the conclusion that he has understood something about her. And by these words, he means that she spoke of her desire to win from the bottom of her heart. Since Civilian doesn't want to show his ability, he decides to cheat. It was for this reason that he decided to use his backpack as cover. But at the same time, the guy has to think through everything several moves ahead in order to avoid getting caught. Therefore, to concentrate more, he closes his eyes and completely surrenders to his thoughts. He's considering what he should do, And options include hydrogen, lithium, and nuclear fusion. For a few moments, the guy freezes, practically not even thinking about anything. And then he again allows the thought into his head, thinking that anything will suit him. If only it were possible to obtain strong electricity from this substance or object. And with this idea in mind, Civilian reaches for his backpack, bringing his idea to fruition. He already had the knowledge of how to do everything, but he just had to act carefully. Civilian pretends to take something out of his backpack, but in reality, he generates the necessary item. As soon as this happens, a powerful glow envelops the area for many miles around. At some point, it becomes so bright that it is impossible to see anything. However, after creation comes decay inexorably, and the glow gradually fades. Civilian looks with pride at the object of his creation, which still continues to crackle with static. The guy can't stop admiring what he's managed to create. And a voice is heard nearby. Shine is convinced that this is, after all, a spatial ability, by telling its owner about it. Civilian laughs, letting the younger one think what he wants, which is what he tells him. Meanwhile, the guy hands the object to the girl, and she asks what it is. Civilian answers evasively, suggesting to his interlocutor that she used this thing as a battery. The girl is confused, but still expresses her agreement with the guy. Seeing that she is hesitating, Civilian asks the girl if she is going to try. She responds with an unexpectedly brisk agreement, saying that she will try her best, and the girl, squeezing the device in her hands tighter, carefully touches it with her ability. Analyzing her sensations, she thinks that she feels a large amount of electricity. It's not just the ability that's reflected in her eyes. It's something she's filled with from the inside. When the girl closes her eyes for better concentration, a hissing sound is heard. The object, which had been in her hands until that moment, suddenly flies up, continuing to emit sounds and sparks. And then the girl pours the power of her ability into him fearlessly. For a more complete and better concentration, the huntress evens out her breathing, taking deep breaths. And at the same moment, the flow of her power becomes more powerful. The electricity begins to crackle even louder. At this moment, the girl becomes like a bomb, which at some point becomes ready to go off. But before that, the huntress calls out to one person, asking him to be careful. Of course, she means Clea, who is too close to the metal slime, and she warns him because she chose this very monster as her first target. And the very next moment, the girl shoots, as she can no longer hold on to the accumulated energy. The stream that bursts out of her hands is very powerful and fast. It does not dry up even when it almost reaches the hunter's target. There are only a few meters left before the collision, and the metal slime reacts. Beginning to feel threatened, he again grows armor. Meanwhile, the huntress's first electric beam already reaches the monster's shell, and a powerful explosion occurs, causing a roar that shakes the earth for many kilometers around. Each of the four experiences roughly the same emotions and wonders if it worked. As the haze clears, it becomes clear that the metallic slime is beginning to spread. Sparks still continue to accompany him here and there, but he continues to spread out. The huntress stares stubbornly at the monster for a while longer, expecting a trick. However, at some point, he realizes that everything ended well. Civilian mentally compliments the girl, amazed at the scale of the explosion she had orchestrated. A gust of wind blows away the remaining smoke and soot, revealing the best possible view. The crater that opens up to view turns out to be truly impressive, leaving those present even more amazed. Civilian is once again mentally amazed at the scale of what the girl has created, and Shine says that if he hadn't been tired, he could have caused exactly the same explosion. Civilian can't help but remind him of her words about him acting like a child. The boy begins to argue with him, denying these words and making excuses, to which his interlocutor ironically agrees with him. Clea joins the conversation, pulling her interlocutors up and telling them to stop making jokes. He suggests that they move on now that they have sorted everything out. The boys shout out in one voice that this is not a joke at all. Their new friend finds this funny, but she honestly tries to restrain herself. The guys, approaching each other closer, continue to grumble discontentedly. Despite his displeasure, Shine snaps his fingers, causing everyone else to fly, and then he warns them that they are about to fly. Turning his head towards the girl, Civilian thinks that he doesn't even know her name. He doesn't even worry about being caught off guard, because it's clear that the huntress is lost in her own thoughts. After thinking for a bit, Civilian finally makes up his mind and, a little embarrassed, turns to the girl. Oddly enough, she responds quite quickly, responding positively. The guy speaks honestly about not knowing her name and asks it. The girl readily answers him, saying that he can call her Oriflamme. Civilian allows himself to smile as he silently pronounces the name of his new acquaintance. Meanwhile, in a completely different place, Crystal asks her interlocutor if this is true. When he answers her question positively, the girl pauses, and after that she begins to speak again, and her words are thoughtful. Crystal asks her interlocutor about how Civilian pulled out the battery and how it was enough for a full-scale explosion. Clea says he was fighting, so he can't be absolutely sure, but Shine saw everything. The girl ponders what happened, amazed that the entire area was completely burned down. Clea confirms these words and expresses joy that there are still parts left to explore. Crystal is satisfied that they at least managed to get a few more clues. The hunter reluctantly agrees with his interlocutor, and then clarifies whether this is all she wanted to say. A silence hangs between them, becoming more tense with each passing second. At some point, the girl slowly turns her gaze to the map, which, among other things, shows that same horned rabbit. Finally, she starts talking again, not intending to give up so easily and leave the topic. Crystal says she finds it amazing that Civilian miraculously obtained a battery after the outbreak. Clea speaks of the ability to change space or even other dimensions. Smiling condescendingly, Crystal asks him if he really thinks so. The guy, in turn, asks if it could be anything else. Crystal begins speaking in riddles, which prompts Clea to ask her a follow-up question. And she replies that if these two hunters start working together, their synergy could exceed all their expectations. Crystal giggles uncontrollably and covers her mouth as if embarrassed by her own laughter. And then, continuing to suppress these impulses, the girl asks Clea if he doesn't think it will be a lot of fun. These strange chuckles, continuing without stopping, make the guy sigh heavily. But this is not news. So the guy wonders what else this girl has in mind. Having first placed a pot of water on the stove, Civilian turns it on. At the same moment, a flame bursts out from under the burner, starting to lick the bottom of the pan. Involuntarily recalling the Oriflame, Civilian thinks that she has amazing strength. Even though the energy for this came from his battery, the guy still can't stop admiring this girl's strength. An example that comes to mind is that Civilian compares her to a mini-bomb. Meanwhile, the water boils, urging the guy to throw noodles into the pot. He thinks about how he hasn't been using bombs lately, only to catch low-ranking monsters. With the help of these bombs, he manages to do his job, and only if he does it right. However, Civilian does not want to use them because the explosion could hurt a person. The guy explains this as the reason why he doesn't use bombs, but continues to think about Oriflamme. Remembering this power, he again involuntarily admires it, because its power is truly enormous. What's even more amazing is that it was released by just one person, this girl. He recalls how, after Oriflame absorbed electricity, the battery exploded on its own. At the same time, the guy remembered very well what the consequences were after using such a technique. Then, Oriflamme began to stagger and almost fell, being close to overexertion. However, Civilian arrived in time, caught the girl, and asked if she was okay. Oriflamme said that everything was fine, but still admitted that she felt weak. But the guy knew for sure, and still knows now, that the girl almost fainted because of this weakness. But Civilian is sure that if the hunter's abilities are enhanced and she herself becomes stronger, she will be no joke. And then the guy, making an anticipatory moan, suggests trying it. He continues to think that although Oriflame needs a battery, this girl's potential is enormous. The guy admits to himself that her power shocked him, and he wants a similar ability for himself. Before beginning his meal, Civilian folds his hands in a prayerful gesture, and then, taking the chopsticks in his hands, he wishes himself bon appetit. As he cools his noodles, Civilian thinks that he needs to work harder too. Continuing to think about this, the boy expresses a desire to improve his pistol. However, he remembers that he currently lacks crystals and clicks his tongue in annoyance. While thinking about upgrading the plasma, Civilian comes up with something better. The guy is confident that if he improves such a weapon, he will be able to increase his firepower. But he remembers what his previous attempts to create something led to. Civilian tried to do this several times, but they all ended in failure. Sighing heavily, the boy wonders if there is really no other way to get to the top. Just as he is about to continue eating, he hears the ringtone of an incoming call. Turning halfway around, Civilian wonders who could be calling him at this hour. However, when he picks up the phone, it doesn't become any clearer, because this number is unknown to him. And yet the guy doesn't hesitate for long. Something pushes him to accept the challenge. On the other side, a female voice says something unintelligible. And then a question comes from the speaker. When the girl asks if he is civilian guard, the guy realizes that this voice is familiar to him. He suggests out loud that it is Oriflame, and the girl, again feeling embarrassed, confirms this. This worries Civilian, because he cannot understand why she needs him. And the girl on the other side, periodically pausing between words, asks the guy if they can see each other for a while. Civilian is one of those people who cannot refuse, so he agrees even to such an unexpected meeting. The moment the doorbell rings, the guy immediately turns his attention to the entrance. And indeed, his guess turns out to be correct, and Oriflame enters inside. The girl immediately begins to look around in search of her friend, and he decides to make her task easier by responding and showing her exactly where he is. Oriflame absent-mindedly acquiesces in understanding, causing Civilian to become even more worried. While the girl is settling in, he mentally wonders if something has happened to her. However, for now, Oriflame remains silent, even when the waitress approaches them and asks what they would like to order. Looking down at the menu, Civilian curses silently, considering these prices to be a bit high. He recalls that this is exactly the rate he earns at his part-time job. Civilian says he'll have a latte, and Oriflame orders the same for herself. When the waitress leaves, the girl again falls into a painful silence. Time goes on, and so on, until their order is brought to them. But even then, Oriflame doesn't say a word, instead taking her first sip. Civilian gets fed up with this and asks the girl how she got his number, whether it was from the lab. Oriflame reluctantly agrees, but her voice sounds uncertain. And then Civilian thinks that he needs to stop Crystal from giving out his number left and right. Oriflame again immerses herself in her silence, although it is noticeable that she is becoming more nervous. And then the guy takes the initiative again, encouraging the girl to tell him everything. Oriflame bows sharply, causing Civilian to flinch and almost choke on his drink. The girl apologizes for her method of communication and begins to justify herself. When everyone starts turning to look at them, Civilian assures his interlocutor that everything is fine. Somehow, the guy manages to get the girl to say that she is here because of that battery. Expressing his assumption, Civilian clarifies whether she really needed her again. Oriflame confirms this, saying that in order to use a strong ability, she needs something like this. The girl offers to buy this battery from the guy, and he thinks about her words. Oriflame becomes decisive again, saying that she will pay for this battery as much as the guy needs. Seeing such determination, Civilian involuntarily plunged into memories. He remembers that this girl behaved exactly the same way, saying that she wanted to win. And then the guy asks her directly why she needs all this. Oriflame expresses confusion about this, and Civilian speaks again. Repeating his question, he clarifies whether she really just wants to make a big bucks out of this. Memories flash before his eyes again, but this time they concern him. The guy recalls how he himself had repeatedly prepared himself to escape in case of danger to his life. Moreover, he suggested that his companions do the same, seeing no other way out. Civilian even spoke openly about this to Crystal, warning her of the potential outcome. And now he asks the girl if she is scared, because even with such a strong attack, it will be difficult for her to defend herself. Oriflame agrees, saying that she really did almost die even last time. She says that this is clear without words, but there are reservations. Saying that she must catch them anyway, Oriflame corrects herself by saying that she wants to catch them herself. And Civilian, noticing such a look, understands that he has become the same again. And yet the guy doesn't back down, asking what all this is for in the end. His interlocutor does not answer the question and again falls into silence. Minutes pass like this. Civilian does not rush the girl, but still continues to wait. And then she answers. But the answer is just one word, and it's simple. Oriflame's voice becomes more confident and polite as she asks that the question be dropped. Civilian suggests that it might be painful for the girl to remember this, and then he agrees, saying that he accepts her proposal. The girl cries out in disbelief, asking if this is true, and generously thanks Civilian. However, her interlocutor, pointing a finger at the girl, hurries to warn her. He says that in exchange for this, she must repay him with 4 low-grade crystals. The girl is puzzled by this and confusedly repeats individual phrases and words after the guy. Civilian confirms his words but tenses up, afraid that he has named too high a price. But it turns out that Oriflamme expected a much higher price, and the guy mentally laments. But still, the guy clears his throat, trying to regain his former confidence. And he suggests to his interlocutor that she first go and pick up what she needs. Oriflamme asks if it can't be done here, and Civilian replies that it's too crowded. Confirming his words, he says that for this reason we will have to wait a little bit. And Civilian suggests to his interlocutor that they go look for some quiet place nearby. Despite their successes, they are unable to do this, as there is noise and chatter everywhere. Civilian wonders whether it is even possible to find a quiet place in the city center. Even though he thought about his own home, the guy brushes it off, remembering his piles of trash. The guy is amazed that it is so difficult to find a deserted place at midday. He continues to look around, taking in the various signs, looking for a quiet place. However, all of them are either too loud and crowded, or not suitable at all. Civilian is amazed that this task turned out to be so difficult to accomplish. But at some point, his gaze comes across a motel sign. At first, the guy gets tense just from the thought of it. But then the idea no longer seems so stupid to him. He thinks that nothing else comes to his mind except this place. Civilian turns to his companion to check her reaction to this place. She turns out to be quite eloquent, which makes the guy even more nervous. Civilian tries to calm both of them down by saying that they will do everything very quickly. Oriflamme, although embarrassed, says that she understands everything. Before going inside, Civilian swallows nervously, afraid that the girl might think something unnecessary about him. And then he turns to the girl again, urging her to go. She agrees, stuttering from embarrassment. Once inside and approaching the cash register, Civilian asks how much the room will cost him. The man tells him that if he pays in cash, it will cost 30,000. Agreeing with these words, Civilian looks into his wallet and is amazed. He can't believe that there is absolute emptiness there. The guy asks if they accept cards, to which he receives a negative answer. Then, blushing with embarrassment and afraid to look them both in the eyes, the girl takes on all the expenses. She continues to hide her eyes while all the other formalities take place. Giving the young people one of the key cards, the administrator calls out a number. When he wishes the boys a good time, they unanimously blurt out that everything is wrong. Only when they are in the elevator and the door closes behind them does Civilian allow himself to breathe a sigh of relief. Oriflamme tries to behave quietly, even when they are alone. The elevator stops on the 3rd floor, making a corresponding sound. The young people continue their way to the rented room, still in silence. Finding himself in front of number 303, Civilian places his keycard on the sensor. The moment the door opens, he politely invites the girl to come inside. Once inside with her, Civilian asks if he can begin, and Oriflamme confirms this. Putting her bag on the bed, the girl reaches for the bag sticking out from it. Taking it out, she places it next to her and unties it, revealing low-level crystals. Counting out the required amount, Oriflamme hands them to her business partner. He is mentally surprised, noting the girl's intelligence. The guy curses mentally, belatedly regretting that he didn't ask for more. Oriflamme sits on the edge of the bed, looking expectantly at Civilian, and he speaks. Scooping up a handful of crystals, the guy asks the girl, "Well, shall we begin?" He says the name of his ability mentally, starting the transformation process. And when the necessary thing is in his hands, the guy immediately gives it to the girl. Without saying anything else, Oriflamme thanks Civilian for this. Sighing tiredly, the guy politely asks the girl if that's all. But for some reason, even though she remains silent, she begins to speak negatively and shake her head quite actively. Civilian is surprised by this and asks Oriflamme if there is anything else. And the girl confirms this, asking to create another battery because she has just enough crystals for it. Civilian is strangled by the toad again when he allows the thought to enter his head that he could get even more crystals. And the girl, already hopefully, hands him the second part of the payment. Since Civilian is so reliable, he has no choice but to accept the crystals. And immediately after that, the guy again says the words that lay the foundation for the battery, and the very next moment the motel corridor is illuminated by magical light for the second time. Soon, another energy battery appears in Oriflamme's hands. Even though the girl remains silent, she is glad that Civilian helped her. Meanwhile, the guy asks her to leave the room first, in order to avoid unnecessary awkwardness. But Oriflamme thinks differently. It seems to her that, on the contrary, it is best to go out together. Civilian hesitates, but still says that he is not sure about this. The girl takes this casually, agreeing and saying that in that case, she's going. However, as she approaches the door and lowers the handle down, she stops. Under Civilian's surprised gaze, the girl hesitates a little and remains silent, but she still finds the strength to speak up and say goodbye politely. Civilian reciprocates, thinking that he will be out in about 10 minutes. He smiles good-naturedly until the door closes behind the girl. And then, looking at the crystals, the guy notes that he earned 4 crystals at once. Civilian is considering starting to sell batteries, an idea that seems pretty good to him. And while he is seriously thinking about this, on the other side of the window, on the street, a sound similar to an explosion is heard. The guy mentally wonders what is happening and where the explosion in the middle of the city could come from. However, the sound is repeated several more times, causing Civilian to flinch. The guy starts to tremble, thinking that this simply can't be. The very next moment he leaves the room, rushing towards the exit of the building, not remembering himself. Civilian runs as fast as he can, wondering inwardly if this is some kind of monster. Desperately throwing the door open in front of him, the guy can't get these thoughts out of his head. However, once he finds himself on the street, at first he does not see anything specific in front of him, but the guy doesn't back down, starting to desperately turn his head in search of the cause of the explosions. And finally, he finds something that attracts his attention. And that something becomes a gathering of people. People are worried, talking to each other in completely different tones. When a guy hears a familiar voice, at first he can't even get his bearings. However, his gaze is then drawn to a nearby source, and it turns out to be none other than Oriflame herself. The guy asks the girl worriedly what happened, and she says that she exploded. Civilian doesn't understand how this could have happened, and his interlocutor begins to tell. In addition, the schoolgirls standing behind are discussing how something exploded in Oriflame's bag. They find this amusing, and one of them suggests that the other take a photo. Civilian thinks that they shouldn't attract attention to themselves and need to get out of here as soon as possible. And, glancing at the road, he notices that a taxi is conveniently driving past. Abruptly grabbing the girl by the hand, Civilian asks her to follow him. They find themselves at the roadway just as the taxi is approaching. When Civilian slams the door, the driver asks the guys where they are going. But the guy, not forgetting to be polite, asks him to first move away from this place. The taxi driver does not object, expressing his agreement on this matter. One of the schoolgirls asks another if she had time to take it off, and receives the answer that she did not have time. Meanwhile, the taxi has already moved away a decent distance, and the girl sighs heavily. She says that she also didn't have time to take a photo and expresses regret about this. Civilian and Oriflame simultaneously let out sighs of relief. The guy states the fact that they almost got into big trouble. Oriflame agrees with him, adding that such attention does not lead to anything good. The guy agrees with her, and the taxi driver again clarifies where exactly they need to go. However, Civilian's head is filled with completely different thoughts. He is thinking about why his battery exploded, and yet, at the same time, the guy assumes that he has no choice and will have to take Oriflame to his home. With these thoughts, Civilian names the address where his house is located. The taxi driver agrees and expresses understanding on this matter, while the guy continues his thoughts. He thinks that he couldn't even imagine that the battery he made could explode. The rest of the journey passes in silence, and upon arrival, the taxi driver announces that they have arrived. When he names the exact amount, the guy counts it out and pays. Once they reach the door to his apartment, Civilian asks if she wants to come in. The guy thinks with great embarrassment that he has a real mess inside. Therefore, after apologizing to the girl, he asks her to wait for him a little. And although Oriflame can only guess the reason for this, she agrees with the guy. Civilian slips inside carefully so that the girl doesn't accidentally see his mess. Once inside, the guy spits in disgust, thinking that he was right, but he doesn't have time to crush. So Civilian begins to act quickly. Sighing heavily, the guy mentally notes that he needs to finish and invite the girl inside. Saying that his house is a bit untidy, Civilian allows Oriflame to come in. The girl reacts to this extremely calmly, agreeing with her interlocutor. Once inside, Oriflame politely asks for forgiveness for such a sudden intrusion. However, her gaze when looking at the guy's room expresses a different emotion. Saying that there is no room to swing a cat, Civilian asks the girl to sit on the bed. Taking the crystals in his hands, he calms her down, saying that he will check everything now. In a low voice, Civilian begins to recite the words of his spell. All this time, he carefully monitors the entire process, trying to understand what could have gone wrong. However, so far, everything is going exactly as usual, without any deviations from the norm or changes. But this is not enough for Civilian, and he wonders what could have gone wrong. Thinking that he might have done something wrong, the guy brings up the battery status window. Reading its description, Civilian notes that it is better than the plasma pistol. However, what he needs is not among all this information, and this is frustrating. Then Civilian decides to look at his own status window, assuming that it might be the issue. Beginning to read it carefully, the guy chuckled thoughtfully in the process. He manages to discover the problem, but along with it, the solution is also found. It turns out that only he himself can control the objects he creates. As he delves deeper into the analysis, Civilian begins to get confused, trying to understand what exactly the problem is. He suggests that the issue may not only be in the controls, but also in the greater distance than allowed. All these thoughts make Civilian dejected and start groaning in despair. He tries to understand the best way to solve this problem and hears the girl's concerned question. Forcing a smile onto his face, Civilian agrees with her and says that he is fine. And then he suddenly comes to the conclusion that it all comes down to one thing. Cursing quietly, he scolds himself for making such a stupid mistake. Looking at this girl, Civilian understands that the explosion of the battery is his responsibility. He feels uneasy just thinking that this device could have been not in the bag, but in the girl's hand. The guy blames himself for not studying the instructions more carefully. He keeps beating himself up because if he had done that, this wouldn't have happened. Plucking up his courage, Civilian confesses everything, saying that it is all his fault. Oriflamme is puzzled, asking incomprehensibly what exactly he means and why he thinks so. Civilian says that everything will be fine if the battery is handed over for a short time. But first, it must stay with him. Oriflamme asks what they should do then, since these crystals are all she has. Civilian remains silent, stalling for time, because the situation they find themselves in is not a pleasant one. Unable to bear it, the guy looks away, running an unpleasant thought through his head. Despite his reluctance to do so, the guy understands perfectly well that Oriflamme needs to repay the debt. He plans to return the crystals to her and add something else to them, since the explosion was his fault. Thinking about how much this was weighing on his soul, Civilian suddenly stopped himself. He comes to the conclusion that it is not necessary to hunt alone. And then Civilian turns to Oriflamme, and she responds willingly but a little frightened. A guy asks his interlocutor if she would like to hunt with him. Oriflamme repeats the words after him so slowly, as if she does not fully understand their meaning. Meanwhile, Crystal, in her laboratory, chuckled thoughtfully. Taking one of her protocols in her hands, the girl turns over several sheets. She runs her eyes along the lines until she finds what she needs. And only then do Crystal's lips stretch into a satisfied smile. The girl calls her secretary with the order to call Clea and Shine to her. The subordinate responds to the laboratory director with unwavering agreement. Crystal utters only one word, but from it becomes clear that what she has been waiting for a long time has happened. And indeed, the girl adds that she has found what she had been looking for so long. Every time the foot steps on the ground, it crunches loudly. This forest stretches for many miles, and it is very easy to get lost in it. That is why those who are here now use a navigator. Continuing to make their way through all this jungle, the couple stubbornly moves towards their goal. However, at some point the younger one gives up, unable to withstand such a long and difficult road. Breathing heavily, Shine asks his interlocutor to rest at least a little. Clea refuses him and reminds the younger one that they can't do this. Shine gets angry, saying that Crystal always burdens them with hard work, and he also hates walking. In response to this, the elder says that they must respect this girl. Before he starts to object, Shine takes a deep breath, and then he starts listing the rejections they received because of confidentiality. Clea agrees with her interlocutor, also starting to speak in favor of confidentiality. Shine interrupts him, saying that he knows that means they can't be seen by people. Clea expresses satisfaction, and the younger one clicks his tongue in displeasure. Checking the map, the hunter thinks about what will happen if Crystal's words are true. However, something makes the guy distracted from his thoughts. With a sharp jerk of her hand, Clea makes her companion stop. After this, silence hangs between them for a few moments. The hunters listen to the surrounding sounds, but Shine can't stay silent for long. So he asks if this means they've arrived. Just in case, Clea checks her navigator again. Having finally made sure that this is indeed the case, the hunter agrees. When they start to look closely, their gaze catches something that stands out from everything else. Shine wonders if it was just his imagination and leans forward. However, the next moment, some indistinct muttering reaches his ears. The creature in front of them says something in a language unknown to them. Because of this, Shine begins to feel terrified and begins to speak involuntarily. And even though he does it quietly, the hooded figure immediately reacts to the teenager's voice. She jerks forward, causing the thin fabric to fall from her head, revealing who was hiding under the cloak. Clea quickly rushes to the younger one, covering his mouth so that he doesn't accidentally scream again. The unknown creature continues to look around in search of the one who disturbed its peace. It's clear that he failed to detect the hunters. But even so, this monster's aura is frightening. Clea continues to hold the younger one, and he swallows nervously, mentally thanking his friend. He mentally wonders whether he should attack the monster first. Clea pulls herself up, reminding herself that it's not time yet and she needs to watch. And yet, a question pops into his head that if a monster attacks them, it makes him tense. And the creature in front of them at this moment gradually begins to approach them. The aura that emanates from him causes an involuntary tremor throughout the body. Even the ever-calm Clea finds herself involuntarily sucking in a breath because of this. Meanwhile, the creature stops again, but begins to turn its head in different directions. It says something again in an unknown dialect, but judging by the intonation, it becomes clear that it is a question. At the same time, it turns around and goes in the opposite direction from the guys. Only when the monster is at a sufficient distance from them do they allow themselves to breathe a sigh of relief. Clea notes that he does indeed exist and adds that half the job is done. Junior starts to talk about what Crystal said, but stops. He notices that Clea doesn't like the tone of his voice, so he corrects it. The boy asks if they are close to what Crystal was talking about. The elder hunter nods, accompanying his gesture with words confirming his agreement. But he says that seeing it is one thing, and catching such a beast is quite another. The boy quickly picks up on this, saying what he's going to do then and snapping his fingers. And the next moment, a whirlwind begins to form in front of him, joyfully greeting its creator. And the boy, with anticipation and hope in his voice, asks if they are going after him. Meanwhile, in a slightly different location, Civilian activates his ability. And the next moment, a battery appears in his hands, crackling as usual. The guy throws it to the person next to him, accompanying the movement with appropriate words. The battery is caught by hands that are already familiar to us, and immediately a female voice is heard. Clutching the object tighter, an extremely pleased Oriflamme thanks the guy. For some unknown reason, Civilian begins to feel uneasy about this, but he quickly overcomes himself and, sharply throwing away his weapon, points it at the enemy. It turns out to be the hound we know, and it lets out a warning growl. And the next moment, her relatives appear next to her, and the dog rushes forward with them. Civilian asks a rhetorical question, asking, "Well, shall we shoot?" And the very next moment, his shot rings out, spreading throughout the entire area. Meanwhile, these guys, with the help of Shine's ability, continue their activities. The boy sighs, assuming they've almost reached their target. The elder hunter shudders, his back covered in goosebumps from a bad feeling. And then, right next to him, a terrible, heartbreaking roar is heard. But Clea manages to react quickly, thanks to which she avoids the dangerous blow. Trying to keep his opponent in place, the hunter asks the younger one to get ready. Civilian continues his own fight, reloading his weapon. The frenzied barking of the hounds surrounding him attracts other individuals. Driven by their instinct, they flock together in several packs and run, urging each other on with their barking. But Civilian shows no fear, bravely continuing to fire at the monsters alternately from two cannons. Repeating their movements, the blaster beams quickly rush towards their target. However, the dogs do not pay attention to this. Their primary goal is to tear the victim apart. Naturally, there is a harsh price to pay for this, but predatory instincts cannot be overcome. And yet, thrown back, one of the individuals lets out a plaintive whine. The rest, ignoring her, continue to run towards Civilian. He, realizing the scale of the unfolding battle, quietly utters a curse. But the guy doesn't back down, continuing to fire his guns. He successfully manages to hit 2 of the 3 targets, and Civilian awaits the result. It lives up to his expectations. The hounds begin to run away from the source of the explosion. Then, Taking advantage of this moment, Civilian turns around, addressing his partner. She carries out his command as soon as the guy voices it, and he thinks that it is time for the second step. Without wasting a second, Oriflamme uses the battery, synchronizing with it. Swallowing nervously, Civilian thinks that now it is time for the third step. With these thoughts, the guy throws a nanowire at the feet of the nearest dogs, finding itself dangerously close to her. The hound only has time to sense something is wrong, because the next second the net bursting out of the device entangles her. And not only this particular individual, the improved version of the nanowire allows for much more. Civilian grins contentedly, thinking with satisfaction that his plan worked. The hounds, as usual, continue to growl and bare their teeth no matter what. At the same time, they desperately try to break free from their bonds by pulling on the net. Noticing the overly active attempts of some of the individuals, Civilian becomes puzzled. Looking closely at the drones, the guy notes that they can barely withstand such an onslaught. Civilian mutters sullenly, fearing that they won't be able to hold out like this for much longer. As if echoing his thoughts, the drones begin to walk around, miraculously still remaining in place. The restless hounds, however, continue to try to escape from the snare. Civilian grips his pistol tighter and curses with remorse. He simply has no choice but to finish off at least the most violent individuals. Of course, this does not pass without a trace. The explosions lead to even greater unrest. One of the hounds manages to break free very successfully and make a quick leap towards Civilian. Realizing that his life is now hanging by a thread, the boy shouts out the name of Oriflamme. The girl, shouting over the loud barking of dogs and the crackling of her static, says that everything is ready. Realizing that the situation is about to become critical, she immediately fires a volley of her electricity. This saves Civilian from certain death, and, being prepared for such an outcome, the guy abruptly steps back. After he himself falls to the ground, the body of the hound falls down in front of him. There are still charges around, and the guy groans, exhausted and at the same time relieved. However, this was only a small part of the hounds. There are still others left, and they are not sleeping. The nearest dogs rush straight at the girl, barking furiously along the way. But Oriflamme is ready for such a development of events, and it is charged at full capacity. Even her eyes sparkle when the girl is about to perform her maneuver. And, having completed her preparations, the huntress directs her energy towards the hounds, unleashing all her wrath upon them. However, it not only destroys those who run towards it, but also acts in advance. This explosion is so powerful that it not only deafens, but also blinds. Even Civilian gets it from this, and the guy has to turn away and lower his eyes so as not to go blind. After some time, he carefully opens his closed eye. What the boy sees ahead leaves him dumbfounded, and he can barely contain the urge to scream. All the dogs in front of him are either dead or in their death throes, and then the guy swallows nervously, amazed at the scale of the destruction caused by Oriflamme. It turns out to be truly impressive, because in front of Civilian there is not a single dog that is capable of moving. Thinking about the fact that more than 60 hounds have been defeated, the guy grins, noting the high fighting spirit of this girl. Meanwhile, a rustling sound is heard behind him, causing Civilian to turn around. Oriflamme, as if not believing that she did it herself, says, "Who would have thought?" At this moment, Civilian gets up and begins to shake off the road dust. After this, picking up his backpack, the guy smiles contentedly and turns to his partner. He asks her if their agreement to go deeper into the thicket is still valid. The girl is surprised by this, asking if he really wants to do this right now. Civilian confirms this, smiling and saying that once they have started, there is no turning back. Oriflamme decides not to argue with the guy, and they continue on their interrupted path, going deeper and deeper. Meanwhile, Clea continues her own battle, but her opponent is more agile. The push is so strong that the guy is thrown back several meters. Moreover, such power knocks all the air out of the hunter's lungs. Seeing how bad things are for his friend, Shine desperately screams out his name. Physical strength gives way to will, and Clea falls from a height, collapsing exhausted. His opponent, however, is not going to make any concessions, clenching his fist to deliver his next blow. He gets quite close, but an obstacle appears in the monster's path, preventing him from moving further. This boy created it. Although maintaining this kind of barrier is difficult for him, to everyone's surprise, The monster stops without making any further attempts to attack, but he starts mumbling something again in a language unknown to Shine. For a few long moments, the monster freezes, as if changing its mind about fighting. And the next thing he does is he lets out a very slow and drawn-out breath. This makes Shine relax a little, but he realizes that he was wrong in his assumptions, because the very next moment, his clasped hands fall heavily and sharply onto the dome in front of him. The boy once again has to infuse his construction with strength in order to withstand the powerful onslaught. It's worth it, because even though the blow is powerful, the monster fails to break through Shine's defense. However, the teenager had to put in a lot of effort to achieve this, and now he is exhausted. Now his opponent begins to say something, clearly pleased with this result. And the next moment, several blows fall on the shield at once, not much less powerful than the previous one. Completely unprepared for something like this, Shine begins to tire even faster. The boy is horrified by the realization that he cannot last like this for long, and the monster continues to strike blow after blow, sparing neither himself nor especially the boy. He himself desperately shouts out an appeal to his friend, urging him to wake up. But Clea turns out to be deaf to this cry, because he too was hit pretty hard. But it only seems that way at first glance, because if you look closely, the guy moves a little, and the next moment his eyes suddenly fly open and he takes a greedy breath. Quickly assessing the situation, the senior hunter overcomes himself and gets up. At this time, Shine continues to hold the dome, not yet noticing his friend who has come to his senses. And all this time, he is afraid to relax even for a moment, because he fears not only for his life, but also for the life of his comrade. However, the next moment, the latter appears behind the monster, striking him. But despite the fact that this attack was supposed to be unexpected, the monster manages to stay on its feet. And yet, the blow turns out to be quite good, as a decent mark remains on the monster's skin. And then he, clearly unhappy with what is happening, begins to growl with anger. Shielding her younger comrade with her body, Clea asks him how he feels. In fact, if the guy would only look at Shine, he would understand everything himself, but he doesn't. Therefore, the boy, taking advantage of the opportunity, only squeezes his hand, which is aching with pain, even tighter. And then he says it's all nonsense and he's perfectly fine. The elder hunter allows himself to look at him and mockingly asks, "Really?" To this, Shine responds with good-natured agreement, saying that it could not be otherwise. After making sure the boy is not seriously injured, Clea takes up her sword, preparing for battle. He signals to his partner that he is ready for battle. The reason for this is that Shine will be involved in this too. It is their common technique, and in order to begin its implementation, the teenager snaps his fingers. At the same moment, his whirlwind rushes towards Clea, starting to interact with him. This comes as a complete surprise to the monster, and he is at a loss for a few moments. And Clea is already too close at this moment, fueled by Shine's ability. The monster clenches his fist tightly, preparing to deliver a blow similar to the one he used to knock the guy down last time. However, now Clea manages to deftly get around her opponent, ending up behind. With the corresponding sound of the blade, the now senior hunter strikes. The monster makes a hissing sound and begins to regroup. He manages to avoid his opponent's next blow and now has his coordination back. After this, they clash their weapons again, crossing them with a corresponding clang. The clanking gives way to an insistent crackling sound when the tension becomes too obvious. And then, watching everything carefully, Shine snaps his fingers again. His ability picks up his comrade, allowing him to merge with the air currents. Clea's opponent begins to actively rotate his head in an attempt to find his opponent. The same one again, at what he considers to be the most opportune moment, finds himself behind the monster. But the monster manages to sense it and turns away, wanting to strike back at his opponent. He fails, as Shine again makes Clea disappear right from under his nose. And the very next moment, the hunter appears from the most unexpected side. The monster begins to growl angrily again, belatedly realizing that he can no longer dodge. Then instead he turns around as quickly as he can, wanting to make an attack in return. However, instead of retreating, the hunter fearlessly throws his blade forward. When its blade touches the opponent's hand, the sound it makes is as if it were not a hand at all. But Clea has no intention of backing down, so he tries to see things through to the end. It works, but only partially, and his next blow is met by the monster's skin with a sound that is already familiar to him. To avoid trouble, Clea moves again with a characteristic click. However, his opponent is not going to let him go, starting to look for him with his eyes and growl. The monster's instinct makes him look up, and he indeed finds the hunter. Overwhelmed by the currents of Shine's ability, Clea soars high into the sky. He doesn't remain inactive for long. Everything ends when the air around the guy starts to swirl. The hunter grips the hilt of his sword tightly and gives it a sharp twist. After this, he performs a feint, pretending to throw away the blade. In fact, the guy immediately flies up to him, sharply grabbing the handle and squeezing it with both hands. And so the hunter begins to descend quite briskly from his height, approaching his opponent. This comes as a surprise to him, but the monster manages to put his forearm in front of him. Before making the next gesture, the younger hunter chuckled contentedly. The flow of his wind envelops Clea again, beginning to merge with it into one whole. After this, the hunter finds himself in a completely different place and is already preparing his weapon for an attack. The airflow created by Shine allows Clea to move even faster. Thanks to this, it penetrates very deeply into the flesh of the hunter's opponent. However, this is not enough for Clea, and he twists the blade in the wound. This allows him to not only penetrate deeper into his opponent's flesh, but also pierce it right through. However, at the moment when the blade almost reaches the monster's face, he intercepts it with his free hand. It turns out that his palm is not so strong. This is clearly visible from the drops of blood. But Clea, having felt such a quick taste of victory, does not stop. He literally screams, trying to achieve his goal together with the monster. And at some point, the hunter's efforts are rewarded. The sword enters the flesh. It happens with a nasty, disgusting crunch, and blood sprinkles the clearing. The monster's body falls limply, like a rag doll, straight down. Despite this, blood continues to flow from the open cuts for some time. Well, in another place, several shots are heard once again. Despite the aggression in their red eyes, for some reason the hounds stand calmly in their places. However, the very next moment, the first of them begins to fall, unable to stay on its feet. Following her, a similar fate befalls all the other individuals. And from the fired pistol, smoke still slowly comes out in a thin, hissing stream. Oriflamme is glad that everything happened very quickly and safely. Civilian agrees with her, adding that it all seems so easy. The girl agrees, noting that this way one can hunt weak monsters of different types. However, she adds that one should not forget about their peculiarities, and the guy agrees with her. However, Civilian mentally notes that even the lowest level is not easy to overcome. The guy compares life to a game, saying that they are completely different. After all, the leading factors here are abilities, situation, environment, and mathematical variables. Combat effectiveness here is not determined by level, and if this happens, it is very rare. Oriflamme puts in its 2 cents, adding that careful preparation is important here. Civilian agrees with the girl, saying that all this is undoubtedly true. Oriflamme is thinking about this more seriously, considering that upgrade to be preparation. The guy nervously shudders, reminding his interlocutor that he said that he had failed several times before. Still, he agrees, admitting that the upgrade is an unresolved issue. He remembers that this has already failed 5 times, and remembers the absorbed crystals. Civilian also recalls that he even tried to swallow 10 of them at a time. Oriflamme is amazed, calculating the cost of each one that the guy just threw away. Civilian begins to discuss the cost of a regular pistol, drawing a parallel with the one he absorbed. Oriflamme suggests that in this case, he try to improve something else. Civilian answers her negatively, but there is regret in his voice. And then he confidently says that he will continue to conduct the experiment, even if it takes a long time. Hearing the words about the experiment, the girl asks about it again to clarify. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, a pair of hunters continue their journey. The grass crunches under their feet in a familiar and almost non-irritating way, and the younger one begins to suffer from shortness of breath again. He even begins to breathe only through his mouth. He makes his way through the bushes after his older comrade, but despite the difficulty, he says nothing. However, the elder hunter suddenly stops, but Shine does not pay attention to this. Clea was also tired, but he was exhausted not so much by the difficult journey as by the previous fight. But the younger one stubbornly continues to walk, wanting to prove to his idol that he is no longer a child. But the moment he gets in front of Clea, He senses something and gets scared. To make it in time, he shouts loudly, warning Shine of the danger and asking him to be careful. Luckily, he has enough strength to move forward and stop the younger one. Feeling a strange emptiness under one of his feet, Shine lowers his eyes. What the boy sees makes him stutter with fear and ask what it is. And he means this huge hole, from the bottom of which the echo of a fallen stone is only now rising. But at the same time, strange noises of unknown origin and the howling of the wind are heard from there. Shine drops a few more rocks from above to test how deep the hole is, but there is still no sound. And this makes the younger hunter swallow nervously. Strange noises continue to come from the bottom of the pit, but they no longer sound like the howling of the wind. Suddenly the sounds change, becoming a shrill and terrifying squeak. This causes the boy not only to recoil, but also to fall to the ground. Shine starts to laugh, but his trembling cannot be hidden by his bravado. The next moment, the teenager's voice sounds muffled as he addresses Clea, and then the boy acknowledges the fact that he almost died and laughs nervously again. Under Clea's watchful gaze, he acknowledges the fact that he has expended too much energy. However, the thoughts of the senior hunter, alas, are now in a completely different place. Remembering this monster, the guy also notes to himself that he can speak. At the same time, the hunter remembers their confrontation, as well as what his opponent did. It follows from this that he is quite intelligent, because how else could he have come up with something like this? Clea speculates that the creature may be either a high-level hunter or an actual monster. Meanwhile, Shine manages to get to his feet and let out a tired breath. Ominous sounds start coming from the pit again, and one of the boys suggests to the other to go in there. Meanwhile, in another part of the forest, Civilian is deep in thought. He wonders if his idea will be possible to make reality if he absorbs a large number of crystals at once. The guy thinks about the number of items that can be created by providing others. He notes that up until this point, everything had been almost correct, with only a few exceptions. However, this is not a good thing, because it is in the past. Because now everything is completely different. Thinking about his eternal failures, the guy sets himself up to try to think differently. Clenching his fist tightly, Civilian is about to try a new approach to this matter. This time, he wants to use much more than 10 crystals. But still, in the back of his mind, the question thrums. Will he be able to carry out his plan this time? The voice of the Oriflamme is heard nearby, bringing Civilian out of his thoughts. She asks him if everything is ready. Turning to face his interlocutor, the guy answers her affirmatively, saying that she will then watch everything from afar. The girl asks Civilian to tell her when he is finished. The boy thanks her, thinking that Oriflamme promised not to interfere with him while he creates a new weapon. Civilian feels embarrassed in front of the girl for this, but he is truly grateful to her. And before starting his business, the guy takes a deep breath, and then, approaching the backpack with crystals, he rhetorically asks, "Well, shall we try?" Carelessly pouring out his materials for creating new items, Civilian thinks. His thoughts were that he would not be able to hold such a number of crystals in his hands at once. And then he tries a new way, placing his hands on top. For a moment, Civilian hesitates, and in this pause, his heart begins to pick up speed. It thunders in the guy's ears like an alarm, making him start to worry even more. In order to calm down at least a little, Civilian takes a deep breath and exhales just as slowly. After this, he hesitates a little longer, but the guy's determination has already become stronger. The next moment, Civilian speaks the words that activate his ability. As soon as this happens, power begins to emerge from under his hands, accompanied by the usual glow. However, due to the large number of crystals, the noise is much louder this time and can be heard much further away. And this applies not only to sounds. The glow this time is also many times more powerful. It illuminates not only the perimeter, but also becomes visible from other corners of the forest. But this process, like any other, cannot last forever. And at some point, it subsides. And only after Civilian realizes that the deed is done, he opens his eyes. What awaits him makes the guy not only open his eyelids wider, but also almost scream. And the very next moment, a triumphant smile appears on his lips. The residual flow of the boy's power after using it passes through the weapon like a rustling wind. And Civilian, beside himself with joy, notes out loud the fact that he succeeded. Goading either himself or his comrade, Shane suggests moving forward. However, he can't even move because Clea stops him. The elder hunter hesitates, pausing, as an internal struggle takes place within him. Gripping his weapon tightly, he wonders in his mind if they really need to go in there and check everything out for themselves. Intuitively understanding that the answer is yes, the guy pours energy into his blade. However, the effect turns out to be far from what he expected to see. But that is understandable. Clea thinks that he is not in the best condition now, as he has spent too much energy. The guy wonders in his mind if this is really necessary. But at the same time, he thinks that he still has a little strength left. The older hunter turns to the younger one, asking him if he can check the den. The boy nods in agreement, but says that his strength won't last long, so he'll do it quickly. Clea agrees to these terms, because they need to sort everything out, and asks Shine not to overwork himself. Snapping his fingers, the boy activates his power, which immediately begins to swirl around him. But this time, something a little different happens. The wind doesn't pick up the boy. It takes his form. Streams of air seem to come out of Shine, becoming his double. All this time, Clea has been closely observing this entire process. As the ghostly boy takes flight, approaching the pit, hissing sounds are heard above it again. Before continuing on his way, he turns around to look at the guy. He, interpreting this as an expectation of approval, nods in agreement. Then, filled with confidence, the copy of Shine spreads his arms out to the sides and leans forward. With its characteristic sound, it rushes down towards the unknown. When the wind ghost dives down, its movements are lightning fast and swift. Sometime later, Shine, who is above, unlike his copy, sighs heavily. He is so focused on his task that he is sweating profusely. Glancing at his watch, the teenager mentally notes that enough time has already passed. The wind ghost should have returned long ago, but for some reason, he is still not here. And just at that moment, it would seem, he reaches the bottom of the pit. But not everything is so clear-cut. What appears beneath his feet is something completely different from what he expected. Instead of a solid surface, there is water. As soon as the projection tries to look around, it notices something that puzzles it. Along with the projection, Shine is also puzzled. The teenager cries out in amazement and uncontrollably. After this, he suddenly loses his strength and, falling to his knees, begins to tremble and groan exhaustedly. Seeing her friend suffering, Clea approaches him and asks worriedly about his condition. For some time, the boy doesn't even find the strength to answer. But then he says that he thinks he's found what he needs, although he's not entirely sure. The elder hunter's face changes, thinking that they have finally found what they were looking for. But he doesn't allow himself to get too lost in thought, extending his hand to his friend. He immediately accepts the support, placing his own palm into Clea's. And when the older hunter helps Shine up, the boy groans with effort. Glancing at the sky, Clea invites the younger one to come back. He doesn't say anything in response, but nods, thereby expressing his agreement. And with these thoughts, in solidarity, the hunters head back in the direction they came from. However, at some point, Clea stops and turns around. He looks towards the pit in silence, but conflicting thoughts are swarming in his head. Meanwhile, an ominous squeak is heard from there again, which does not bode well. But the senior hunter pulls himself together and, pulling himself together, reminds him that it's still too early. However, clenching his fist, he also mentally adds that they will return here again soon. When they return to the laboratory, night has already fallen on the city. Leaning back in her chair, Crystal begins to speak. She clarifies with her interlocutor, asking him that the two of them are not enough. Clea confirms these words, saying that, who knows? Maybe there is someone stronger than that monster. The girl chuckled vaguely and said that now it was no longer a secret to anyone. The hunter responds by saying that he has several people in mind. His interlocutor's first reaction is surprise, and then she speaks up again. Crystal asks Clea who these people are, and as these candidates the hunter names, Civilian and Oriflamme. Hiding a satisfied grin behind her words, Crystal asks the guy the reason for this. Clea tells the girl about how he saw Civilian at the training center. The guy says that back then he didn't look like someone who stood out much. Clea suggests that this man was not noted at the training center as a highly skilled hunter. Crystal thinks about it and says that perhaps Civilian is connected to some group of hunters. The girl praises Clea's memory, arguing that he remembers a man who was not particularly remarkable. The hunter brushes this off, saying that he is just preparing for what awaits them all. Crystal says that makes sense and wants to continue, but the guy interrupts her. He says that there is no time to waste, otherwise they will miss them. And besides, He sees this as an excellent opportunity. It is about bringing together Oriflamme and Cialian, as Crystal wanted. To this, the girl says that in that case, they need to be called. Sometime later, a helicopter lands at the laboratory's helipad. Coming out of it, Cialian notes that this place is very noisy. Following the guy out of the helicopter, a girl emerges, letting out a heavy sigh. First, the rhythmic clicking of heels is heard, and then their owner appears. When meeting her guests, Crystal greets them graciously. Cialian returns the favor, noting that they haven't seen each other for a long time. Oriflamme also keeps up with him, but greets him more formally. Without wasting any time, Crystal invites the young people to go inside and talk there. After the last cup is placed on the table, there is a moment of silence. Cialian can't stand it and interrupts him first, asking the laboratory director why she called them. The girl no less directly notes the straightforwardness of her interlocutor and says that she has an assignment for the hunters. This time, Oriflamme enters the conversation, asking a clarifying question on this matter. The scientist starts from afar, saying that the horned mutant rabbit and the metal slime are connected. Hearing these words, Cialian immediately remembers his battle with both of them, and he immediately asks Crystal what she is talking about. And the girl sets a condition. She says this information is top secret, and they need to make a choice. Hearing the question of whether they could risk their lives, both hunters swallow nervously. And while the guy is thinking that this conversation is strange, the girl says that she agrees. Crystal warns her that if problems arise, the lab won't be able to help them, like with the metal slime. Oriflamme says that she understands this, but she has already decided everything for herself. Cialian also expresses his agreement, saying that he will not stand aside either. Crystal reiterates her words about confidentiality. When she expresses hope that the boys understand that this all needs to be kept secret, they confirm this. Clapping her hands loudly, the scientist suggests starting, and suggests that this conversation could prove very interesting. Starting to talk about their country, the girl corrects herself, saying that monsters can hide in many other countries. Cialian nods understandingly, agreeing with this, and adds that there are a lot of them. The woman gently reprimands him, saying that she means monsters among men. Hearing the words that they may be not only of one kind, but even more, the hunters become wary. They ask the scientist what she means, but she asks them to listen to her first. Crystal says that although the purpose of infiltrating the ranks of people is still unknown, monsters are definitely among them. She says she also doesn't know what exactly they want: the death of humanity or peaceful coexistence. Hearing these words, Cialian can't stand it and starts laughing nervously. He thinks that all this sounds like fairy tales, because it's hard to believe even in the existence of such monsters. And yet, the guy allows the thought that if a scientist says so, it might turn out to be true. The thought that monsters are not only among people, but also exist in human form makes him tense. The guy starts shaking his head, trying to drive away the terrible thoughts. Meanwhile, Crystal says that she has found proof and begins to talk about the mutation of low-level monsters. Oriflamme asks cautiously if this hasn't always happened. The scientist agrees with her, but adds that she means that the number of these mutations has increased. Saying that perhaps this doesn't seem like a reason to ask him for a favor, she asks the boys to look at something. When the scientist turns on that very screen, all eyes in the room turn to it. Cialian speaks up but immediately falls silent. He simply doesn't have the right words. Crystal explains that this screen marks all the locations where mutant monsters appear and praises them. As she repeats that mutants have appeared before, Cialian notices a familiar rabbit. It turns out to be the very same creature that he managed to catch for the first time. Crystal confirms this and points to an image of a metal slime that is also familiar to them. Cialian asks her if this is really the proof. The scientist agrees that this does not prove anything, and says she has conducted further research. Switching the slide, she says that she was trying to determine where mutant monsters usually appear. An image of a creature that is also familiar to only 2 of the hunters present appears on the screen, and the scientist informs the others that this monster was caught by Shine and Clea. Crystal says that this creature can talk, but its speech is different from human speech. A teenager joins the conversation, saying that catching this monster was difficult. Cialian is much more concerned about the fact that the monster can talk. The boy reacts with hostility, asking if he is really calling him a liar. Shine continues to speak heatedly, but at that moment, Crystal's hand flies into the air. The teenager still doesn't like this arrangement, but he just chuckles resentfully. Crystal remarks that even though they can't understand this monster, It's better than nothing. And Civilian begins to think about monsters that can speak, believing that they have intelligence. This again makes us consider the idea that such creatures may indeed be hiding among people. Without giving the guy time to think things over, Crystal grabs his attention with the next shot. The girl begins to talk about how, having dealt with this monster, the hunters continued their search. She states with certainty that there are definitely monsters in this place, and the scientists' #1 goal is to find other evidence, and also, concurrently if possible, destroy the monsters. Hearing something like this, each of the boys shudders. But for different reasons. Civilian reminds Crystal that she doesn't know for sure whether these monsters are dangerous or not, but the girl says that the monsters are their enemies, because they were the first to show aggression and attack. But Civilian, replaying the memories in his head, now wonders if this is true. Crystal asks them to check everything first, because for now their goal is search and reconnaissance. When Oriflamme hears words about war, she asks if there is a possibility that it will not happen. And her interlocutor, in response to this, says that she really wants to believe it. The next moment, Crystal rises from her seat and approaches Civilian. When she extends her hand to the guy, he doesn't quite understand what this girl is trying to achieve. Meanwhile, she asks the hunter whether he will try to do this for her or not. Civilian looks at Oriflamme and notices that she is looking straight at him. Such a close gaze makes him feel uneasy. And the boy looks at the other hunters. This kind of attention to his person makes him feel uneasy, and Civilian begins to think feverishly. He asks himself why he feels like he's being drawn into something big and under so many pairs of eyes. Unable to bear it any longer, Civilian shakes the woman's hand. He says, "So be it," and expresses his agreement to try to make everything a reality. However, Civilian sets a condition that he will go and see everything for himself. Oriflamme smiles indulgently, and the other hunters agree with her. Shane voices the thoughts of everyone present, smiling and saying that he expected nothing less from Civilian. Giggling playfully, Crystal says she relies on them. Sometime later, the car is already racing at great speed towards the forest. When she stops abruptly, Crystal is the first to exit the salon. All the soldiers standing at the fence, without any agreement, turn their gazes towards the new faces. The girl walks towards them with her usual hip gait, feeling extremely inspired. The same cannot be said of her passengers, with Civilian being particularly uncontrollable, saying he feels sick. The rest of us also feel not that much better, being almost on the edge. Having recovered a little, Civilian turns to the guys, asking if Crystal always drives like this. Shane's words about many people not being able to stand this raise further questions for him, and the girl just laughs at this and says that they have arrived where they needed to. She has already managed to agree on everything and stands invitingly at the border, inviting hunters inside. Now the first of them moves from his place, and soon all the others follow suit. Shine suggests moving forward because it's unknown how long everything will take. Civilian teases the younger one, asking him if he is pretending to be strong when in reality he is trembling with fear. Oriflamme maintains a friendly atmosphere, saying that she will protect him, and the boy gets excited, screaming slightly aggressively and asking who asked her about this. Clea remarks that they shouldn't linger any longer and invites the rest of the hunters inside. Crystal speaks loudly to be heard over the rising wind, wishing the boys good luck, and then he adds more quietly, asking each of them to return alive. Even just breaking through the gaps in the treetops, the sun is scorching. Wiping sweat from her face, Oriflamme sighs heavily and turns to one of her companions. She asks the hunter how long it will take. Clea says they're going in a straight line, but it's unclear whether they'll have to spend the night here. The girl expresses only understanding out loud, but she feels uneasy. Civilian thinks that the current situation requires keeping everything secret. He continues his thoughts on this matter, understanding why all modes of transport were excluded. At this time, Shine lets out a laugh and says that with his ability, they could easily deal with it. Clea, in her usual manner, pulls up the younger one, reminding him that this is not allowed. Civilian also understands why this is necessary, because something could go wrong, and Shine's powers would be needed. The guy concludes that all they can do is walk. His thoughts are interrupted by Shine's disgruntled voice, which says that then they need a car or a helicopter. And then Civilian himself could not stand it any longer, sternly calling out to the younger hunter. Looking up at the elder, he asks in confusion what is going on. Civilian quickly softens his expression and says he's just bored. The teenager doesn't like this answer, and in this case, he suggests that the guy have some fun with Oriflamme. Clea snaps at Shine, reminding him that he told him not to say that. The boy begins to speak confidently, but stops and mumbles something incoherent. The elder hunter tells him to apologize to the girl and to treat her with respect. Shine stubbornly refuses to do this, again starting to shout. Then Clea resorts to extreme measures, again, but in a scary voice, addressing the teenager by name. Knowing firsthand what this entails, he expresses his understanding, and then he reluctantly but politely apologizes to Oriflamme, speaking to her formally. This makes the girl feel uneasy and she starts to hesitate, but she accepts the apology. Civilian thinks sadly that this is once again a one-man show. Meanwhile, Clea notices something and freezes in her tracks. He raises his hand so that it can be clearly seen, and so that everyone understands that it is time to remain silent for now. However, not everyone understands this gesture, and Shine asks the hunter why he did this all of a sudden. And then, to make it clearer, his interlocutor makes another gesture, asking the younger one to be silent. Civilian tenses up because he already guessed what this all means. And to confirm his words, Clea the very next moment says that he senses a monster. Experiencing a wide range of emotions, the hunters freeze, obeying Clea's command. The same one, taking his sword out of its sheath, asks them to get ready and be on the alert. Shine suggests that this is probably unavoidable. Then Civilian, not wanting to receive the title of a burden, activates his ability. The weapon appears in his hands at just the right moment, because a yapping sound is heard nearby. But it doesn't sound like normal foxes, and Clea explains to those who don't know. The hunter calls these creatures fire foxes, and Oriflamme assists him. The girl adds that these monsters look quite capricious. They are rare, and those with one tail are between the low and middle levels. Civilian is also familiar with them, so he thinks that due to the species' characteristics, it is very difficult to resist these creatures. At the same time, the guy remembers that firefoxes walk in groups of 3 or 4 individuals. Turning to Oriflamme, Civilian addresses her, inviting the girl to repeat what they did in their training. The huntress agrees to this, immediately catching the battery. The next moment, she begins to recharge, and Civilian thinks. The guy thinks about how to more effectively stall for time until the girl completes her phase. And then, to everyone's surprise, Shine volunteers to do this, saying that he will hold off the monsters. However, Civilian has a slightly different plan. First and foremost, he intends to ensure the security of the rear. As the nanowires fly and spin, they attach themselves exactly where the guy points them. In this way, Civilian will implement the already announced part of his plan. And the guy adds to himself that this way the firefoxes won't be able to attack them from behind. Meanwhile, the first creature is already very close, emitting an ominous yapping sound. Clea is the closest to her, and they clash. The creature turns out to be very agile, and its claws are sharp, so it manages to draw first blood. However, Civilian wasted no time at this point, already preparing his new weapon for attack. It charges faster than a plasma pistol, so the volley is fired in the next instant. But the guy doesn't intend to end there, preparing for the next attack. The firefox notices something wrong quickly, reacting to the slightest vibration in the air with lightning speed. At first, it is not entirely clear what she is doing, but the next moment explains everything. As the creature descends to the ground, it raises its tail high and something begins to happen to it. 3 burning clots separating from him rush towards danger as quickly as all the fox's movements. Of course, it is the projectiles fired by Civilian. At their final point, both sides merge into one, and a rather impressive explosion occurs, from which nothing escapes. It is so bright and large in scale that Civilian is forced to cover himself, and then he grins sadly, noting the rather impressive intelligence of the firefoxes. Meanwhile, Clea races towards her target, eager to seize the opportunity. Not even a second passes before the sound of cutting flesh rolls through the area. Blood bursts out of the cut in a fast stream, breaking up into small splashes. The hunter stops, because his work is completed. Civilian, wanting to raise morale, states that one of the firefoxes has been defeated, but the very next moment he notices others and warns his comrades about them. Clea, who is closest to him, expresses his understanding. Meanwhile, 2 firefoxes are rapidly approaching them. Civilian thinks that if things continue like this, they will catch them without any problems. However, everything changes when a wild howl comes from an unexpected place. The hunter turns sharply towards the sound, wanting to find its source as quickly as possible. And he notices something glowing right above the net he had set up for safety. Shine also notices this individual, and the realization of this makes him feel uneasy. Civilian wonders in his mind what kind of monster could be capable of a surprise ambush attack. Meanwhile, the firefox, looking intently at its target, is already preparing to attack. Civilian mentally notes that this individual is much stronger than those mid-level ones. Clea, echoing his thoughts, adds, suggesting that it could be a mutation. Well, the firefox chooses its target no less wisely, attacking the most defenseless ones at the moment. Clea, realizing that things are getting tough, shouts out her friend's name. Civilian also expresses his feelings, but only to a greater extent for the even more defenseless Oriflamme. The fox is already very close, and the girl is still continuing to charge the battery. Realizing that she has very little time left, Oriflamme so naively and stupidly asks to give her a minute. Hissing with zeal and inevitability, the girl thinks that she lacks energy, and yet now there is no choice, and Oriflame decides to act. Even though there isn't enough energy accumulated, it's still there, and the girl uses it. It is only natural that with the sense of her kind, the firefox would notice the attack approaching her. She makes movements, trying to either dodge or maneuver, like her relatives did earlier. And Oriflamme's battery charge is already very close. And all this happens in literally milliseconds. The end result of this inevitable collision is an explosion more effective than the last. Just as before, unable to look at him, Civilian tries to protect his face. However, as the smoke begins to clear, something red begins to appear from behind its clouds. Realizing what this might be, Clea shudders in fear, not expecting such an outcome. The fireface doesn't just hold itself stoically, it moves exactly the same as before. Then Shine decides to take matters into his own hands by activating his own ability. Calling upon his strongest wind, the boy addresses the fox, commanding him to die. At the same moment, streams of his nimble ability, like arrows, rush towards the enemy. And, literally a couple of moments later, another explosion occurs, not much less powerful than the previous one. The resulting smoke gradually begins to clear, but Shine is in no hurry to recall his ability. The teenager still has doubts and wonders out loud whether he succeeded. The question is not rhetorical, as Clea answers it, and in the negative. And indeed, the very next moment, each of those present can observe a whole creature. Civilian is no exception and is also puzzled by this, starting to speak in confusion. Meanwhile, behind the hunters, a familiar, eerie yapping sound is heard. Civilian turns to the creature in surprise, but realizes that he is too late to repel its attack. Clea, whose reactions are faster, comes to his aid. This gesture makes the guy feel worried for the hunter, and he asks him if he is okay. Ignoring the question, Clea suggests that Civilian leave the two to him. Meanwhile, the fox, who had already managed to jump back, began to approach again. The guy growls out of despair because he doesn't want to leave his companion alone with dangerous creatures. But this measure is forced, so the guy rushes to fulfill his part of the plan, telling Clea that he is counting on him. He thinks that Oriflamme needs time to accumulate energy again. Therefore, Civilian intends to support her and do so at any cost. With these thoughts, the hunter reloads his weapon, aiming it at a potential target. Reloading and energy accumulation happen quickly, and now the projectile is already rushing towards the fiery fox. She, as usual, notices him almost immediately and immediately finds him with her eyes. This allows the monster to jump away at the most opportune moment. But the fox is not going to stop there. She takes off almost immediately, performing a cunning, deceptive maneuver. After this, the creature turns sharply and rushes straight at Civilian. The fire fox swings as she moves, raising her paw with sharp claws over the guy. It happens so quickly that the hunter doesn't even have time to properly dodge. The fire fox playfully shifts from paw to paw and barks contentedly. The blood dripping from the scratches seem to echo the cunning creature, continuing its mockery. Civilian's hands hang limply at his sides and begin to tremble involuntarily. The guy thinks with bewilderment and annoyance about how stupidly he got caught. Meanwhile, the firefox makes the now familiar movement with its tail, and even more fiery clots separate from the tail, rushing towards the enemy. Not only does Civilian's gaze change, the boy confidently straightens up to his full height, and then he raises his weapon again and begins to repel the attack with his former enthusiasm. Each of his shots hits the target, causing more explosions. Because of this, A dense smoke screen appears between the firefox and the hunter. However, for a creature accustomed to relying on its instincts, this is not an obstacle. It pounces on the enemy, wanting to sink its teeth into him. But Civilian does not give up. He not only uses his weapon as a shield, but also pushes the firefox away from himself. Pushing the creature away from him, Civilian again fires a series of shots, wasting no time. However, despite the quick and sudden attack, the firefox notices her too. And although it seems that she is frozen in a stupor, in fact, this is not the case. The creature's inventive brain has already come up with a solution. To minimize damage, the firefox shields itself with both tails. And yet, by blocking its own view, the creature does not notice one of the attacks. Seeing all this, Shine lets out an uncontrollable cry, stating the fact of a direct hit. Stepping aside, the fox begins to whine pitifully. But she has no intention of giving in and retreating so quickly. Rotating around its axis, the creature gathers strength to fire an even more powerful shot. With nothing to do, Civilian is forced to answer the firefox's challenge again. He fires as many shots as the number of lights the fox directed towards him. Their trajectories correspond exactly to each other, and it becomes clear that a collision is inevitable. And so it happens. The explosion that envelops the area becomes even more powerful than the previous ones. It's impossible to see anything in the resulting haze again, so Civilian begins to peer desperately, remembering what happened last time. The light of a fox's tail flickers in the fog, but it moves cautiously and slowly. But this is enough for Civilian, and he puts his finger on the trigger and quickly pulls it. The beam from his weapon rushes towards the creature with lightning speed, piercing right through the haze. When wounded, the firefox does not have time to orient itself and is wounded. With a final rise into the air, her fiery tails fall with her. Well, and then their fire goes out, revealing completely ordinary tails. Civilian acts cautiously, but even so, he can't help but let out a sigh of relief. Clea, approaching him, asks either the hunter or rhetorically if this is really all. The younger one lets out a sigh of relief and says that the fight is over. Clea, noticing that it is starting to get dark, says that they urgently need to find a place to spend the night. Both Shine and Oriflamme loudly blurt out their agreement with him in one voice. They move forward and walk through the bushes for a while, and then one of the hunters cries out joyfully. Shine is pleased to note the fact that they were able to find a place to spend the night. At that moment, this building appears before the hunters. Civilian sighs with relief, adding that they will finally be able to rest. When entering, the first thing the hunters do is throw off the burden that now seems unbearable to them. After that, they find firewood and make a fire, because it's already starting to get cold. Sitting around the heat source, the young people remain silent for a while. In this silence, someone is the first to take out a dry ration, and the others immediately begin to follow suit. At the sight of food, even such a meager one, Civilian realizes that he has become hungry. He begins to eat greedily, sometimes making too loud sounds in the process. A peaceful expression appears on the guy's face only when he satisfies his hunger. Clea is still eating, and he says that now they need to decide who will be on duty first. Civilian, imagining this in his head, agrees that such a scenario would be quite good, but Shine's gaze becomes surprised, and he asks what it is. Civilian starts from afar, saying that one must be especially careful at night. While he is saying obvious things, Shine agrees with him, and Oriflamme joins him. Then Civilian continues, saying that monsters can attack when they sleep, so a night watch is needed. Clay, deciding everything for everyone, says that only 3 will be on duty, in turns, so that Shine can get enough sleep. However, the boy clicks his tongue in displeasure, saying that he can do that too. Civilian mentally notes that even such a restless boy has a sense of duty. Meanwhile, Clea says to Shine that he has had enough for today, and that he must save his strength. The boy begins to speak, trying to object, and a third person joins the conversation. Civilian says that Shine really needs to get a good rest because he has a lot of work tomorrow. The other elders also confirm these words with a nod of their heads. The younger one clicks his tongue again in displeasure, but still reluctantly agrees with them. Clea determines the order according to which Civilian will be on duty first. Then he, and Oriflamme concludes everything accordingly. The guy, noticing that it is more difficult to be second on duty, suggests that the hunter be first or third. Oriflamme agrees with him, thanking Clea for her concern, but noting that he shouldn't burden himself so much. Clea declines the offer, saying that being second duty is no problem for him. Hearing these words and the persistence in the guy's voice, Oriflamme gives in, agreeing with him. Clea goes over the duty order again, and the other hunters express their agreement with it. The hunter says that everything will be fine if everyone fulfills their duties conscientiously. When the boy says it's time to sleep, he pays special attention to the teenager. Shine quickly agrees, guessing what a refusal could mean. When Civilian rises from his seat, he groans absent-mindedly, and then he says that in that case he went to his post. Finding himself outside, the guy begins to listen to the sounds around him. Periodically, he looks around, casting a glance into the distance so that, if necessary, he can be on the safe side. But for now, nothing is happening. So the guy allows himself to look at the beautiful sky and immerse himself in his own thoughts. He recalls how he recently worked as a cashier and had no idea that he would be doing something so grandiose. And then Civilian wonders if a solution will be found if there is another fight tomorrow. The moon continues to slowly move across the starry sky, and the guy is still thinking. But at some point, leisurely and measured steps are heard behind him, and although they are quiet, in the silence of the night, it is not difficult for Civilian to discern the source of this sound. And then the guy turns around, trying not to show his surprise, because it's still too early for the changing of the guard. However, contrary to expectations, the one who comes out to him turns out to be Shine, and he asks if Civilian is sleeping. The guy thinks that the teenager woke up and he thinks it's cute. However, he quickly pulls himself together and asks the younger one why he woke up. Shine says a little haltingly that he can't sleep, and Civilian thinks about the future. Thinking that there might be a battle tomorrow, the boy tells the younger one that he needs to sleep to replenish his strength. Shine says he knows this, but he can't help himself, and asks Civilian for permission to sit next to him. He doesn't answer anything to this, but this question in principle does not require an answer. Shine sits silently nearby for a while, and then Civilian speaks up. He says that if you want to talk, you need to do it quietly, because there may be monsters nearby. After these words, Shine comes to life and emotionally expresses his understanding on this matter. A conversation starts between them. The younger one offers to talk about anything, because he doesn't know a lot. This is how part of Civilian's shift passes, and later the next day arrives. As soon as the sun rises, the hunting party gathers and continues on its way. They walk like this until they come across the first strangely broken tree. There are also some unusual marks left on the grass. It is flattened in strange places, and then something like a path appears, and the hunters stop. Oriflamme and Civilian, who had never been here before, are stupefied for a while. The guy asks Clea to clarify that this is the very place, and he confirms it. Oriflamme, in turn, asks why only traces remain here, and Civilian recalls how he was told about a fierce battle that took place in this place. He's referring to Clea's battle with that very monster, and details start to surface in his memory. Speaking again about the tracks, the guy asks if the monster's body should not have remained here. Shine answers him, starting to assume that he could have simply been abandoned. But Clea counters, saying that if they wanted to take it, they would have only taken a part for a sample. Civilian thinks, leaning towards the fact that this guy is telling the truth, but the situation puzzles him. Shine starts to comb the area, asking with annoyance what it is. Clea follows his example and comes to the conclusion that someone was trying to get rid of the traces. The hunter shares his thoughts with others, adding that it is too clean here. Oriflamme also joins the conversation, wondering who it could be. Clea notes that if a helicopter had come for the body, they would have known. Shine adds that even if it were a plane, Crystal would have known about it long ago. Remembering the words about this monster having intelligence, Civilian suggests that his relatives could have arranged a funeral for him. They answer him with doubt, but the guy doesn't let go of this thought, continuing to develop it. Civilian believes that if the monsters had intelligence, they could indeed bury their fellows, as even dolphins do. What he means is that these mammals push the dead individual to the surface, and Civilian again says out loud that he is still leaning towards this option. But even despite the argument, no one supports him. Shine even asks the guy not to say strange things, and although Civilian has not seen this monster in person, he vividly imagines this ceremony. The guy thinks that the more he does this, the more scared he becomes. Civilian questions the intelligence of these monsters, but then contradicts himself. In the end, the guy suggests that his companions move on, arguing that there should be more tracks there. No one answers him, but Clea is the first to move. Whether silently agreeing with Civilian or having his own mind, the hunter even breaks ahead. And so, sometime later, they find themselves near that very pit. Not only Civilian and Oriflamme, who have not yet been to this place, but also Shine, being here, experience mixed feelings. And from the pit, as usually happens, at that moment a sound comes, aggravating the situation even more. Civilian quietly makes a sound, saying that it sounds a bit like crying. A conversation ensues between the hunters, during which one of them suggests that this used to be a drainage ditch. Civilian suggests that the boys look inside since they don't really have a choice anymore. Each of those present meekly agrees with him, because that is how it really is. But before that, Civilian speaks up again, as if there are reservations. The guy asks everyone and no one at the same time about how this hole appeared. Clea, who is standing closest to him, repeats his guess that it could have been a drain. Apparently, Civilian hadn't heard this before, because he now asks it again in surprise. He notes that the hole is too large in size, which destroys the theory about a sewer. Clea says it's just a guess because they haven't been down there themselves yet. Civilian drawls thoughtfully, expressing his understanding. Clea says that this is a serious statement, since Shine checked this place last time. However, when he starts talking about reservations, the guy falls silent and pauses for quite a long time. And then he goes on to say that they don't know if it's fake. The momentary silence is broken by a female voice. Oriflamme says that in that case, they really should go down and check everything themselves. Clea does not argue with her. On the contrary, she expresses her agreement. After this, the hunter slowly approaches the edge of the pit. He stops literally at the very edge to address his companions. The guy tells them that he will go first. He doesn't even allow the guys to really process this information while making the jump. Then Shine turns to Civilian and Oriflamme, asking if they are ready. Both hunters respond with impeccable agreement, filled with enviable determination. And then the grass is bent by the first gust of wind, which is evidence of the activation of Shine's ability. After this, he envelops his creator and, picking up the teenager, lifts him off the ground. And then Shine snaps his fingers as usual, and streams of wind rush towards his comrades. Starting to circle around the young people, they do the same thing to them. Thus, breaking away from the ground, they move, ending up above the hole. And after this, all the hunters begin their slow descent into its depths. But it doesn't last forever. At some point, Shine screams out a warning, and at that moment, the wind currents become faster, plunging the hunters down much faster. When they freeze just a couple of centimeters from the water, Civilian curses. He is outraged by this darkness. He says that it is impossible to see anything in it. A familiar voice is heard nearby, saying that he will soon get used to it. Shine sides with Civilian, saying that he still thinks it's a bit dark here. Oriflamme's voice is heard from somewhere. She asks the guys to wait a bit and starts rummaging through her bag. At some point, Civilian, standing directly in front of her, is blinded by a bright artificial light. Shine sighs with relief and says that he feels better now. But this doesn't last long. Someone takes the girl by the hand and takes the lantern from her. Turning off the light source, Clea argues that it is dangerous. He reminds everyone that no one knows what kind of monsters might be here, and they could appear at any moment. Oriflamme disagrees with him, believing that it is precisely because of the light that monsters can be seen from afar. At this time, Shine grumbles discontentedly about the fact that it is dark for him. Civilian suggests an alternative, which is a flashlight on the phone. In his defense, he says that being in pitch darkness is also dangerous. But Clea remains sullenly silent about this. This doesn't last long, and eventually the guy gives in, saying that he will go ahead. Civilian is satisfied with this arrangement, so he agrees. So a group of hunters begins their journey through an unidentified pit. And at this moment, everyone is thinking about their own things. Civilian's thoughts are that he has already gotten a little used to the darkness and can see what is ahead. However, as he moves further and further, the guy becomes convinced of something, and the environment inside helps him with this. The tunnel system and concrete walls give the guy certain thoughts. He's increasingly beginning to think that this place is like a sewer. At some point, the guy even stops to study them in more detail. The sound that was heard next made Oriflamme note that it was rather strange. She continues to talk about how the place is quite dark and notices something, but the girl doesn't have time to get her bearings. Instead, only screaming. The sound that comes next makes the hairs all over your body stand on end. Even Civilian, who has fallen behind his group, hears it and involuntarily shudders. Realizing that he's screwed up, The guy jumps up and rushes forward. At the same time, he mentally scolds himself for being distracted. Since the guy's eyes have already become accustomed to the darkness, he notices a figure in front of him. Running up to Oriflamme, Civilian fearfully asks the girl what happened. It is clear that what happened has greatly shocked the huntress, because she cannot even utter a sound. Even though she is silent, Civilian is almost sure that the girl is ready to burst into tears. But what worries him most now is something else. The guy wonders what kind of monster is there. Even though he doesn't want to look in that direction, he has to, because there is no other choice. What Civilian sees makes him laugh nervously, because he expected something completely different. Unable to believe that Oriflamme was afraid of an ordinary cockroach, the guy becomes puzzled. He admits that he could have made a mistake, but the girl dispels his doubts, saying that it's all cockroaches. Shine also asks fearfully about where they are, saying that he hates insects. Civilian, putting his hand to his head in resignation, says that they scared him. He starts to talk about how they are both adults now but are still afraid of cockroaches, but stops himself. And the thing is that the guy notices something in front of him, which even makes him scream uncontrollably. Involuntarily following the cockroach with his gaze, the guy stumbles upon the following. And in that direction, there is not just one skull. There are simply piles of bones scattered around. Even Civilian himself recoils from this sight, gasping reflexively. A teenager turns to his friend, asking what he is doing there. At first, he himself cannot understand it. But then, when he manages to make out the outlines, he is amazed. Coming closer, the hunter sits down next to the bones to get a better look at them. The realization reaches Oriflamme too, and the girl, dumbfounded, asks where so much came from. After conducting her mini-research, Clea concludes that this pile contains bones of people and monsters mixed together. Shine's voice approaches the group and says that he found it in the corner. Oriflamme is even more horrified, asking who the hell is capable of such a thing. In their conversations and thoughts, they don't even notice the cautious sound approaching them. However, since Civilian is already the furthest away from this place, his ear catches an echo. The guy turns around, not wanting to be caught off guard and to check the situation. At that very moment, someone jumps out of the darkness at him, making a corresponding sound. Taking a closer look, Civilian is puzzled, because it is none other than a goblin. Yielding to the first impulse, the guy recoils, gasping in fear. And at that moment, the clang of a blade is heard nearby, instantly coming out of its sheath. Of course it was Clea, because he had already noticed the green creature. Without thinking twice and not wanting to miss the moment, the guy throws his scabbard at him. Since everything happens so quickly, the goblin only manages to notice them at the very last moment. Naturally, he can't do anything about it. The case is stuck right in his stomach. This knocks the wind out of the goblin, causing the creature to exhale harshly and hoarsely. After this, the hunter himself takes off, wanting to finish what he started. Almost at the very end of his path, the guy jumps up and swings wide, intending to deal with everything in one blow. In fact, that's exactly what happens, as the hunter pierces the green creature's head right through. Clea's gaze didn't show the slightest doubt. He didn't even blink once during this entire time. Well, at this time, Civilian simply falls along with the body of the deceased goblin. Oriflamme jumps up to run up to him and ask if he is okay. Clea, meanwhile, completes the process, removing the blade from the body in one sharp movement. Even as he rises and turns to head back to his group, Civilian remains silent. However, soon the guy lets out his first nervous chuckle and starts laughing. A woman's hand lands on his shoulder, accompanied by a worried cry. Oriflamme asks Civilian if he is okay and if he is hurt. Continuing to smile nervously, the guy says that everything is fine with him. Clea calmly wipes the blood from her face at that moment. When the hunter extends his hand to Civilian, he begins to speak again, saying that it was dangerous. The boy thanks his savior. Shine remarks that if it weren't for Clea, he could have died, and warns the hunter to be careful. At this point, Oriflamme asks where the goblins could have come from. The girl asks this because she always thought that this race always lives in groups, and just as she manages to utter these words, Civilian's ear catches something. Clea also does not remain indifferent to this sound, also straining and listening more intensely. From somewhere in the depths of this place, very scary sounds begin to be heard. With each passing second, they get closer, rapidly approaching the group of hunters. Having come to his senses, Civilian rises from his place and orders everyone to step back. Meanwhile, in the darkness in front of them, Two scarlet and angry lights flash. The hunters freeze, afraid not only to make a sound, but even to move. And in the darkness, several more sounds are heard. And the next moment, others appear next to the first pair of eyes. This makes even Clea tense up. The hunter asks if they have really been discovered. No one answers him. But Shine notes that the number of unknown creatures is growing. Afraid to look at her interlocutors fully, Oriflamme asks them about their plan of action. The teenager answers her, carefully telling her that in such cases you need to run away. After all, creatures keep coming and coming, and there are too many of them. Civilian isn't just going to stand there and wait for his moment. He's going to activate his ability. At the same moment, the space around him lights up, foreshadowing the weapon appearing in his hands. This is what happens when it appears in the hands of the hunter. He grabs it tighter. However, that's not all. Civilian has a plan, and he calls for one more thing. When he throws a battery to Oriflamme, she catches it, but is still surprised. Civilian offers to risk death or victory. He calls on the hunters to find out. That's all Clea needs. And he grips the scabbard of his sword tighter. And the very next moment, with a corresponding sound, he bares the blade. By holding her sword out in front of her, Clea points it at her enemies and allows them to approach her. A few desperate ones are indeed found. The creatures begin to approach him quite quickly, but despite the grinding noise coming from the goblins and their agility, the hunter remains stoic. With one wide but swift strike, Clea draws blood from the monsters. At this moment, Civilian is waiting for his opponents, and they are also rapidly approaching him. As the goblins get closer, the boy reflects on how he hadn't thought about escaping. He continues to develop his thought, thinking that now they have only one thing left to do. Aiming the gun's barrel at the nearest enemy, Civilian loads it. He ends his thought by saying that all they can do is push on. In parallel with his fight, Civilian finds a new topic for his thoughts. It is about goblins in general. He means those that exist in stories and myths, but they appeared in reality. But after they did this, a lot of time passed. And now the goblins are considered to be of a lower level. Civilian recalls that goblins take murder as a joke. This race also loved to torture its opponents before death. But despite the fact that goblins are of a lower level, they pose a great danger. And it lies in one extremely simple truth. Goblins are dangerous not because they are incredibly strong or have impressive intelligence. In reality, everything is much more trivial. The reason this race is so dangerous to others is because they live in groups. These creatures follow only one instinct, and that is to kill. Meanwhile, Oriflamme is already receiving the required amount of energy, and the girl immediately uses it, directing her power at a nearby enemy. At that very moment, lightning strikes him, beginning to entwine the goblin from head to toe. Eventually, the creature's body simply can't take it anymore and falls over, thoroughly fried. Realizing that her plan had worked, the girl let out a sigh of relief, and then she asks, turning to the other hunters, if this is really the last one. With a thoughtful and drawn-out chuckle, Civilian begins to turn his head in an attempt to look around. Not finding a single living soul within his range of vision, the guy answers the question in the affirmative. Shine wonders how many creatures there were, because they were crawling out of literally every crack one after another. Oriflamme starts to calculate and says that there were only 6 of them. The teenager notes that not only does the place stink, but there is also no end to the goblins. He sighs heavily and says that he feels unwell, and his stomach agrees with him, emitting a disgruntled rumble. The boy, jokingly addressing him, asks if he too had a hard time. Hiding a chuckle of delight, Oriflamme asks if they can rest for a moment before continuing. Clea, as the true leader of the group, is the first to agree. The first thing the teenager does is start eating, rewarding his stomach for its hard struggle. The rest decide to spend their allotted time for rest in their own way. Civilian grins, noting that wherever you go, there are goblins. Clea rhetorically asks if they're sure they've come to the right place. But Oriflamme answers him, expressing hope that this is so. Shine suggests waiting a little longer, because he believes that the end is still far away. Civilian agrees with him, adding that it is indeed far from close. And, as always, the sensitive Clea notices something at this moment. The hunter turns to the others the very next moment, asking them to stop. Knowing firsthand that this phrase does not bode well, Shine stops even chewing. Clea takes a careful breath to keep her bearings and continues listening. Oriflamme asks him in an uncontrollable tone about what happened. But her interlocutor answers her. Clea says he just felt the presence of a monster, but luckily it passed by. The girl expresses understanding and joy about this, and Clea says that he thinks it would be better to finish here and go rest. Civilian joins the hunter and asks about how they will be on duty. When he suggests the same option as last time, Clea agrees with him. The guy turns to Shine, saying that this time he simply has to rest. And although the boy does not argue with the elder, he responds with a very reluctant agreement. And so begins their battle with the remaining goblins, which seems endless. They hold on stoically, inspired by the thought that after this, there will be a long-awaited rest stop. However, in reality, at this time, none of the hunters can know for sure whether they will succeed, or else the ultimate goal of their mission will go to waste and they will return empty-handed. And yet, despite everything, the hunters continue to fight, hoping for the best. Despite everything, they do not stop for a moment, cherishing within themselves the faith in a successful outcome. Stopping, Oriflamme speaks, and her voice sounds thoughtful. The girl says that she finds it strange that the number of goblins is gradually decreasing. Civilian echoes her words, admitting that he thought so too, but was not sure of it. And Shine, who is strangely silent at this moment, reacts to something. He thinks he hears something behind him, and the teenager turns in that direction. And indeed, a terrible roar comes from the depths, causing the hunters to shudder. Not only Shine, but everyone else can hear him now. And then Oriflamme makes a sound. The girl suggests that mutants live in that area. Clea silently agrees with her, but out loud suggests going there and checking everything out for herself. No one argues with him, and the next moment the entire group moves towards the terrible sound. At some point, Civilian speaks up, beginning to express a guess. Noticing the monster standing in front of him, he says that it seems they are in place. Clea immediately draws her blade and motions for everyone else to begin. However, he takes off first, while the others are still figuring out what strategy is best to use. But, not wanting to abandon their comrade in trouble, the hunters rush after Clea. Meanwhile, the mutant goblin grips his sword tighter and raises it with a cry to strike. Not expecting such pressure, Civilian groans and even becomes confused for a moment. However, the very next moment, his entire being is filled with determination. He encourages himself with the thought that they will definitely catch this goblin, even though he is so strong and skilled with weapons. At the moment when the two blades collide and a ringing sound is heard, Clea has to apply a lot of effort. And yet, in order to avoid damage, the hunter has to retreat. As the goblin pushes him back, Clea is saved only by his sword, and his opponent doesn't even look tired, as if the fight with the hunter is just a game for him. Then Clea takes off and rushes forward, wanting to try another maneuver on the goblin. Beginning to accumulate energy around himself right in flight, the hunter takes a swing. However, his opponent begins to act completely differently than the guy imagined. This not only surprises him, but also disarms him for a few short moments. Meanwhile, taking advantage of this momentary confusion, the goblin quickly turns the sword in his hand. Accompanying its actions with a furious roar, the creature puts all its strength into the attack. Fear of a potential and completely unfavorable outcome paralyzes the hunter's body. Meanwhile, the goblin lowers his sword all the way, and it goes into the ground. At the very last moment, Clea manages to regain his composure, to which his opponent growls in displeasure. Meanwhile, Civilian is faced with an equally serious problem, and he only has time to be surprised. From all sides and simultaneously, as if from nowhere, the group of hunters begins to be surrounded. Oriflamme can't stand it and asks where they all came from. Civilian, knowing the answer to this question exactly, says that they appeared because of the mutant's summoning. Shine indignantly notes that they will only waste all their energy like that, and the creatures seem to continue to exist, angrily gnashing their fangs. The blonde guy gets scared from something like that, and he curses to at least stop shaking a little. Leaping forward with a wild squeal, the first of the goblins rushes at his enemy. Quickly turning his weapon over, Civilian thinks that he has suddenly realized something. The guy tries to summon all his self-control, but he's not doing it well. And then, recoiling in fear from the approaching enemies, he thinks that this is how he will die. Meanwhile, the goblin closest to him, wanting to give himself a boost, jumps. As it rapidly approaches, Civilian realizes that he does not have the strength to fight, but for some reason there is no pain. Instead, the creature almost right next to my ear freezes and screams. His cry sounds surprised and short. He can't really understand what just happened to him. And then the goblin's body falls to the ground and, after twitching a couple of times, freezes forever. The Oriflamme, turning to Civilian, asks him to come to his senses and not let himself be caught off guard. The guy, feeling awkward, mentally notes that the energy will soon run out. He involuntarily turns his gaze to another part of the room, assessing the condition of the other hunter. Watching Clea fight, Civilian notes that the same fate will soon await him. The effect that Oriflamme has on him is sobering. Clenching his fist tightly, he wonders if there is really no way out of this situation. The hunter's hand relaxes as a thought arises in his head, and then he says the words that are needed to activate his ability. Placing his hand under the object appearing in the air, the guy continues to think about his plan. Just a few moments later, a battery is already lying on Civilian's hand, and the hunter appeals to the Oriflamme, calling out loudly to her. He, just as they were used to, throws the object to the huntress, who finally paid attention to it. When she cries out in confusion, the guy says that it's time to use it. The girl continues to look at him in surprise for a couple more seconds, but then she understands everything. However, not being entirely confident in the success of the idea, she asks if it will work. Civilian notes that if they continue like this, they will all die together from fatigue. That's why the guy considers his idea to be their last hope. Clutching a battery in her hand, his interlocutor remains silent for a while, thinking about something. And then, filled with confidence, she agrees, saying that she will try. Then Civilian, jumping up from his seat, turns to Shine, asking him to cover both him and the Oriflamme. The boy doesn't need more. He just expresses understanding on this matter. At that moment, there is a crackling sound of static, and Oriflame is already beginning to put Civilian's plan into action. Noticing something amiss, the goblin closest to her decides to take advantage of the moment. Civilian, who is carefully observing the situation, in turn notices this movement. He literally screams at the boy, urging him to pay attention to Oriflame. At this moment, he himself approaches the girl, covering her with himself and not allowing the goblin to harm her. The younger hunter also arrives in time, asking the self-confident creature where it is going. Just one wave of his hand is enough to fill oneself with his power. The boy's hair changes color, indicating his complete concentration and unity with his ability. Then Shine hits his opponent with a powerful stream, causing him to scream. The creature's scream echoes in the ears until it is replaced by the sound of stones shattering into pieces. Meanwhile, the boy is already directing the next volley at his target. He also achieves his goal, slamming into the green body at full speed. The other goblins freeze, looking intently at their fellow. The same one, sliding down the wall into which he was pressed, already unconscious, remains silent. And then a commotion arises among his relatives. The creatures begin to chatter warily. They gnash their teeth and hiss in anger, but still do not dare approach the hunters. Civilian speaks up, asking his comrades if they think they have surprised them enough. Shine is the first to answer him, confirming these words and prompting the elders to attack. However, the goblins prove to be more agile, deciding to attack the people first. But Shayna doesn't care much, and as he rushes forward, he confidently says that they can handle it. Meanwhile, the battle between the swordsman and the mutant goblin becomes more and more fierce. However, at some point, the monster is attracted by an excessively loud sound. Looking away, the goblin realizes that it is coming from the static of the Oriflamme, and the moment he sees her, he realizes that the other hunters are up to something. Clea notices changes in her opponent's behavior, and he doesn't like it. And the next moment, he makes one sweeping and careless movement. At the same time, it turns out to be incredibly powerful, as it forces the hunter to fly away. At his final point, the boy crashes into a stone wall, causing a loud bang. Shine notices this and desperately shouts out the name of his older comrade, and the mutant goblin continues to make dissatisfied sounds and moves from its place. The creature forgets about its previous opponent and again turns its gaze in another direction. Now it sees before itself only one target, which, unlike itself, is deprived of such an advantage. Taking a break from his work, Civilian notices something is wrong and tenses up. Meanwhile, the mutant goblin continues to move with great confidence towards his new goal. Civilian grits his teeth and says with displeasure that this is not all. Realizing that things were getting tough, the guy fired another volley from his weapon, but at a new target. He hopes to somehow delay the moment of collision between the monster and the girl, to buy time. But the creature repels each of the volleys, spending almost no effort or time on it. And then Civilian desperately shouts out Clea's name, still continuing to hope for a successful outcome. But because of the haze in the direction where the guy is, it is almost impossible to see anything. However, the very next moment it becomes clear that Civilian's words had an effect. And yet, the hunter's blade never manages to meet the goblin's body, as he again skillfully parries the blow. But despite the fact that the hunter understands the difference in strength, he does not give up, stoically enduring the blow. The goblin takes approximately the same position, but growls in displeasure because his plans were disrupted. So he's going to fix everything and once again remove the annoying hunter from his path. This blow also proves impressive, but Clea breaks contact, remembering the possible consequences. This makes his opponent even more dissatisfied, and he begins to seriously lose patience. Meanwhile, Oriflamme has almost finished her preparations and asks her companions to fall to the ground. Assuming she has been heard, the huntress moves on to the next part of Civilian's plan. He, seeing this perfectly well, echoes her, ordering everyone in an even louder voice to immediately duck. Since the boy is standing closest to him, the guy rushes towards him, shouting the teenager's name. Acting preemptively, Civilian takes matters into his own hands, wanting to keep Shine safe. Meanwhile, Clea's opponent makes another wide and powerful lunge. The hunter manages to duck at the last moment, and the blade passes his face literally a few millimeters away. At this moment, Clea hears Civilian's call and decides to improvise a little. He falls to the ground directly from this position, which, due to the height, turns out to be quite advantageous. And Civilian himself, squinting tightly, prays out loud that everything will work out. The place where the Oriflamme stands changes its color and begins to glow brighter. The girl continues to accumulate the charge so that it becomes powerful enough. With only a little time left before her preparations are complete, the huntress takes a deep breath. By concentrating on her breathing and the power of her ability, Oriflamme finally allows the energy to release. The brightest light illuminates the faces of the nearest goblins, forcing them to squint. And then, in just a couple of moments, a static dome forms, cracking with a corresponding sound. The youngest one stands up first and speaks up, asking if it's all over. Wandering his gaze around the room in search of the figure that interests him, the boy suddenly freezes and gasps. And the thing is, Shine, unable to see everything in detail from such a distance, begins to worry about his friend. However, there is no need, because the mutant goblin was still struck. He just hadn't had time to fall yet. While Civilian is coming to her senses, Oriflamme thinks that although she doesn't know why, she was able to feel something. Feeling around the wall with her hands, the girl wonders if this is the wrong place. Civilian says there must be a clue here somewhere, and his guess is not unfounded. After all, this mutant goblin standing in such a place was most definitely protecting something. Shine doesn't share their enthusiasm, suggesting that the guys go somewhere else. Lost in his own thoughts and oblivious to his surroundings, the boy stumbles. Taken aback, Shine didn't even have time to put his hands in front of him. He just screamed, saying that it hurts. The boy begins to rise, and Civilian addresses him. The older hunter hurries to the younger one, asking him how he is and asking him to watch his step. However, he doesn't manage to finish his thought, because the guy notices something. Right in front of him, there appears a gap that was clearly not there before. And indeed, the very next moment, it begins to expand even more. The guys are amazed by this phenomenon and admire its effectiveness. And some simply suggest going further. The moment all the hunters are inside, Shine can't take it anymore and starts vomiting. Oriflamme proves more resilient, but she is still outraged by what she sees. The thing is that in the room they found themselves in, experiments were being conducted on people and monsters. Some are still sitting in cages, more alive than anyone else, waiting for their moment. Even the unperturbed Clea says that this is the first time he has seen such incredible cruelty. And, as if echoing his words, one of the experiment's victims lets out a terrible roar. His heart-rending cry reverberates throughout the room and even extends beyond its boundaries. The creature screams incessantly, as if hoping that it could escape to freedom. As they passed his cage and the cages containing all the other test subjects, the hunter's heart sank. But still, Civilian can't help but look inside, and what he sees there makes the guy's heart bleed even more. And yet it is Civilian who turns to everyone else and suggests that they leave. The boys silently obey the guy, But a plaintive sound reaches the ears of Oriflame, who is walking behind everyone. He seems like something incredible in this place. And this is what makes the girl stop. The sight that appears before the huntress turns out to be even more touching than she imagined. Because of this, tears well up in the girl's eyes, and determination begins to mature in her head. Oriflamme is about to go to the baby to calm him down, but she is stopped. Clea says that the fox must be killed, because when it grows up, it will pose a threat to people. These words cause an irresistible heat in the girl's chest, but she cannot say anything intelligible in response to these words. The guy's tone is incredibly calm when he states that Oriflame herself understands everything perfectly well. Hiding her eyes so that her true emotions would not be visible, the girl agrees with him. The trio tries to shut off all their feelings while the most cold-blooded of their group dispenses justice. The flame of the firefox's tail fades as usual, and he becomes completely ordinary. And just as habitually, a crystal appears in the place where his defenseless body had just lain. Taking it in her hands, Oriflamme hesitates for a moment, and then speaks. The girl asks her comrades for permission to keep the crystal. She is even willing to pay for it. Understanding her feelings perfectly, the guys simply nod in agreement without adding a single word. Instead, the next moment, Civilian suggests that his company move on, and they continue their journey along this endless corridor of experimental prisons. Civilian says that the unspoken rule has been broken. He means that people and monsters must protect. The guy states the fact that this place is a real experimental laboratory, and when they go a little further, an even stranger view opens up before them. And it's not about the monsters on the other side of the glass, furiously trying to break out, although in this place they look even more disfigured than in the previous sections. It's all about who's standing in the center of the room, watching the mutants with a strange expression on his face. Civilian asks Clea how the monster got there since they killed it, and he confirms it. Meanwhile, the strange creature makes a sound and starts pressing some buttons. When the screens flash in front of him, the mutant begins to carefully study the information on them. Civilian says that although he doesn't know what all this means, he is absolutely sure of one thing. Clea is the first to read his intention, because he is thinking about the same thing. Oriflamme joins the boys, activating her own ability. The younger one, too, although the wound from the previous skirmish is still fresh in his memory, does not lag behind his older comrades. And the next moment, when Civilian is sure that everyone is ready, he gives the order. The creature, hearing a loud and unfamiliar voice, turns sharply towards it. It again begins to speak in a strange dialect, which none of those present can understand. However, it does not hesitate, bending to the ground and beginning its terrible transformation. Civilian, observing this metamorphosis, mentally calls the one who appears before him a monster. But he changes his mind and, correcting himself, calls this monster the devil himself. Meanwhile, the creature, without wasting any time, lets out a piercing scream. It continues to sound for some time, but Civilian endures it stoically. The creature, having finished screaming, quickly takes off and rushes towards its first target. At that moment, Clea was already rushing towards him with her naked sword at the ready. The younger one is not going to lag behind either. Instead, he activates his ability with a loud cry. Civilian, doing the same thing, only silently, sends the nanowire flying. Oriflamme needs more time to prepare, so the girl concentrates on this. Meanwhile, Clea unleashes a series of slashing blows, trying to hit her opponent as effectively as possible. On the other hand, Civilian comes to the rescue while supporting his comrade. The monster growls with displeasure, clearly about to do something. But one of the hunters speaks up. Civilian, noticing that Oriflamme is already ready, tells his opponent that it is too late for a maneuver. And at that very moment, rushing past him, the electric charge hits the target exactly. However, Civilian turns out to be wrong, and he realizes this the very next moment. The girl, who has already encountered such protection, involuntarily recalls the metal slime, and their opponent stretches his ugly mouth into a grin and says something. And then he takes off and rushes forward with impressive speed. Clay rushes after him, even though he understands that their forces are unequal. And yet, the hunter stubbornly continues to strike the monster blow after blow. Civilian, realizing that the situation is critical, mentally wonders what they should do. He desperately urges himself to think about what he can do to catch this monster. Continuing his active brainstorming, the guy activates his ability. At first, the process starts as it should, But the next moment it becomes clear that this is not the case. Civilian thinks with distaste that nothing is working out for him. But despite the failed attempt, the guy tries to pull it off again. The efforts do not pay off. Everything happens exactly the same as last time. The next attempt is exactly the same. Civilian fails again. Meanwhile, Clea continues to fight the monster, already starting to get tired. Shine screams loudly at the hunters, asking them to do something. Under this pressure, Civilian once again tries to activate his ability. This time the process is different from all the previous ones, and Civilian, not believing it, wonders if he really succeeded. Looking at what is in the guy's hands, Oriflamme asks what it is, and whether he really wants to feed this object to the monster. Civilian says it's a bomb and explains that it's not automatic because it didn't have enough power. Despite the device's appearance, it is capable of controlling the area of the explosion at the will of its owner. When Oriflamme tells him that the guy is going to launch the bomb, he says that she will see it now. And then he activates his ability again, but this time putting on the equipment. The guy takes off on his miracle boats, clearly showing his comrades what he means. But there is no time for praise and compliments, so he immediately flies straight at the enemy. Civilian notes that he looks as if he doesn't see him yet. However, the very next moment the guy is called out from behind, his name being shouted out in concern. And then, the monster definitely notices him and lets out a deep roar. Civilian thinks that there is no way back, and besides, this is a direct action bomb. And behind him a loud voice is heard again, asking the guy to be careful. Shine comes to Civilian's rescue with his nimble wind stream. By commanding them, the boy makes a gust of air pick up his comrade and direct him exactly where needed. On top of that, Civilian has his flying shoes, which makes his job easier. At the moment when the monster opens its mouth, the guy wishes him bon appetit. Involuntarily, under the influence of inertia, the monster immediately swallows the bomb. To avoid being hit, Civilian rises higher, flying further away. As soon as he thinks the distance is sufficient, the guy points his finger at the monster in anticipation. And the very next moment, an explosion occurs, accompanied by Civilian wishing his opponent a safe journey. While the guys are saving their eyes, the guy thinks that this is a sign. He himself looks carefully at the place where, according to his calculations, the monster should stand. Although for now nothing can be seen because of the smoke. When everything clears up, it becomes clear that Civilian's idea was a success. With a sigh of relief, Oriflamme says that now is definitely the end. But Civilian has his doubts. The hunter who approaches them says that he also assumes this, agreeing with the girl that this is so. Oriflamme asks if everything will be okay now. Civilian replies that he would like that. However, that is not all that the hunter Civilian would like to do in this place. He wants to make a closure. To do this, the first thing the guy does, of course, is activate his ability. He does this several times until bombs and nanowires appear all around the perimeter. After this, smiling contentedly, the hunter suggests that his companions run away. As soon as they are at a sufficient distance from this place, Civilian carries out his plan. The explosion that occurs inside is truly impressive, shaking the walls around it and scorching the space with its own heat. This causes Shine to let out a long cry and say that this is too much. In some ways, he turns out to be right, because the heat from this explosion and its consequences at some point overtake the hunters. But everything turns out well. They manage to escape, and Civilian breathes a sigh of relief. So, standing in front of the rubble, our hero wonders whether this is the end, or just the beginning. He thinks that he doesn't know this, just like no one else. But Civilian is sure of one thing. Hearing the approaching light steps, the guy gets up from his seat and greets the woman who has approached. She reciprocates his feelings and hesitates a little before doing anything further. And then, mentally urging herself to be confident, Oriflamme takes Civilian by the arm, and thus this couple continues their journey to their final destination. At this moment, their acquaintances are busy with their own business, and Civilian continues his thought. He thinks that they will continue to move forward no matter what happens. Not knowing what is happening in the depths of this pit, the guy wonders if they did the right thing. However, without finding an answer to his question, he concludes that it will take a long time to understand this.